Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where we have unusually in-depth conversations about the world's most pressing problems, what you can do to solve them, and why freshwater reservoirs will be the post-apocalyptic Tinder. I'm Rob Woodland, head of research at 80,000 Hours. I expect this interview is slated to become a fan favourite that people will be mentioning to me for years to come. It's information dense, almost to a fault, and because Luisa and I are good friends, it's also particularly conversational. Luisa Rodriguez has conducted research at Rethink Priorities, the Future of Humanity Institute, and the Forethought Foundation, as well as for Will MacAskill's upcoming book on long-termism. And I'm happy to say she has now brought her considerable intellect to the 80,000 Hours research team. We cover so much substance in this interview that it's worth giving you a sense of the structure at the outset, I think. The main question we are trying to address is whether a global catastrophe that didn't immediately cause everyone to die, such as, say, a particularly terrible pandemic, would be a temporary setback or would permanently curtail what humanity could ever accomplish. We discuss two different potential mechanisms by which this could happen. The first is that humanity quickly bungles its attempt at recovery, and so everyone remaining dies within decades. The second option is that humanity stabilizes things and persists for hundreds or thousands of years, but for some reason gets stuck and never manages to recover to the level of technology we have today, let alone anything better. Through the conversation, we try to give some thought to disasters that kill anywhere between 50% and 99.99% of people alive today. And we also want to envisage cases where most infrastructure is destroyed, as well as those where most infrastructure is unaffected. As you can imagine, all of this represents a vast question that requires us to draw on all the social sciences, on history, on engineering, on various bits of natural sciences, on war studies, and other fields besides. As a result, the conversation bounces between different considerations and historical anecdotes at a pretty rapid pace. A few times I refer to 99% of people dying, but then us quickly rebounding to where we are today as humanity being okay, which might be a little bit confusing, not to mention a bit morbid. To be clear, I am strongly against having a 99% chance of dying in a global apocalypse. However, in this interview, we're taking a minute to look at things through the lens of humanity as a species that has already persisted through many past natural catastrophes for hundreds of thousands of years, rather than thinking about any of us as individuals. The last 25 minutes are something completely different because I ask about Luisa's fascinating personal backstory of reconnecting with her father, who raised her as a small child, but then disappeared from her life for over a decade. You'll be able to hear how much fun I had doing this interview, and I hope it's almost as much fun for you in the audience. All right, without further ado, here's Luisa Rodriguez. Today, I'm speaking with Luisa Rodriguez. Luisa studied sociology and anthropology at Carleton College before doing a master's in sustainable international development at Brandeis University. After that, she worked in a series of global development roles, interning at GiveWell and Innovations for Poverty Action, before a stint as an analyst at the charity evaluator Impact Matters. She then switched focus, investigating various global catastrophic risks at Rethink Priorities and as a contributing researcher at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. She then moved on to the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research, where, among other things, she has been doing research for Will MacAskill's forthcoming book, What We Owe the Future. But the best news is that last month she came to her senses and is joining us as a researcher here at the greatest place to work in the whole world, 80,000 Hours itself. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Luisa.
Thanks so much for having me, Rob.
I hope we'll get to talk about historical disasters and how hard it would be to survive in a post-apocalyptic world. But before that, heartwarming stuff, what are you working on at the moment and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I just started 80,000 Hours about a month ago, and I've been working with Ben Todd to kind of revamp 80,000 Hours Key Ideas homepage. We're hoping to make it more digestible, more appealing to readers so that more people can get on board with our key ideas.
Cool. Yeah. Any early reactions to what 80K is like?
Oh my gosh. It's great. It's, what is 80K like? I think I had this image that 80K was this utopia where employees were really productive and really thoughtful and cared a lot about their mental health. And it just is true. They just are really productive and really thoughtful and really good at thinking about mental health. So very happy to be here.
Yeah. What's the mental health stuff, if you're willing to talk about it? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I already had this experience working at other effective altruism organizations where it seems like people try to be open about mental health and especially supportive about taking measures to make mental health better. But I think more than anywhere, 80,000 Hours is my check-ins with my manager, Arden, are many of the questions are very targeted questions about things that relate to my kind of psychology in particular and things in particular I struggle with. So one of my questions is are you finding any communications with a team member that you find intimidating, especially aversive right now? If so, let's send them a message together.
Yeah.
And that's just like, I just get to be really open with Arden about things I find hard or scary or unmotivating. And that's very embedded into our communications and management. And then we just troubleshoot things much more quickly than I ever have at other places.
Yeah. I guess it's not many workplaces where people talk about like what antidepressants they're on Slack.
Right,
and, like
exactly.
share recommendations on what drugs to take.
Yeah, exactly. So like I have been switching antidepressants a bunch lately because they have lots of side effects. It's annoying to find the right one. And I just get to tell Arden, like, this is the week I'll be on the new one. And it's going to be kind of hard for me because maybe I'll be nauseous. And Arden's like, great, you should work a bit less and then tell me when you're feeling better.
Yeah.
And that's pretty special.
Yeah, it's deep pragmatism.
Yeah.
I guess we've added to our meetings or my meetings with Howie. It's like a thing. Are you avoiding doing anything this week because you're scared of doing it? Because especially like things that you haven't done. I guess like a lot of people, I fall into this trap sometimes of I haven't done things for longer than I thought that I should, and now I hate to think about them, and so I just stop doing them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fortunately, it's not like as much of an issue as it used to be, but I think that's. Maybe it's good to be honest about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I do just find that there are really effective solutions. Like you have to like jump through the embarrassing hoop of being like, I'm avoiding this very small thing for a bad reason. But as soon as you do, like Arden will just sit next to me and just hold my hand almost literally while I do the aversive thing. She's like, okay, let's just write the email to the person and I'm just going to watch you. And I can even help you draft it if you want. And then it just like is solved when like in your head it can be impossible.
It'll never be fixed. Yeah. I can't remember the last time. I guess Kieran's listening in. He might recall sometime when I think I was just like, oh, I just can't bring myself to do this thing. And I think Kieran just did it.
Yes,
basically.
Totally. Yeah, I'm all about trading aversive tasks. Like offering
I'll
my
file
time.
your taxes and like
exactly. It's so much easier.
Yeah. Maybe someone else can do the call with like that annoying family member.
Yeah, exactly. Just like pretend to be me. Yeah.
So what's the story behind how you ended up in this paradisical 80,000 hours?
Yeah. So I like the story. I'm proud of the story. So I was working in global development, I guess 3 and 4 years ago, right after graduating from university. And I had read The Life You Can Save and a few other effective altruism books and was super convinced that I should try to do the most good. And at the time, I was mainly convinced that I should do the most good to help people alive today, especially in poor countries. So I was, for a while, doing research for Innovations with Poverty Action, which does the randomized control evaluations of global poverty interventions. So I thought of myself as like a researcher in global poverty, and then slowly became convinced of the arguments for long-termism. And basically, that was hard and scary because that meant maybe changing my whole career, but applied for advising from 80,000 hours. And I don't think I even did a formal advising call, but I did talk to Brenton Mayer, who had like some ideas for like ways to get experience, but mostly actually was just like, I think Rob Wiblin might want to hire researchers. Do you want me to introduce you and see if he's hiring? And so he did. And I think I did some job tasks for you and then ended up trialing. I think this is 3 years ago now.
Yeah.
And then I was super new to long-termist research and to being actually professionally working on EA topics. And also I was just feeling really impostery during the trial. So it was a very stressful trial. And it sounds like I was, I don't know, promising maybe, but clearly didn't have as much experience on the thing. And so I think you recommended I try to get research experience elsewhere and then maybe come back. So at the time I had a job offer from Rethink Priorities and you suggested if I could do long-termist research there, that might be a good way to get experience. And so I tried that. And I worked on nuclear security there. And then while there, went to FHI, Future of Humanity Institute, and did some of the collapse and recovery stuff there, and then did some of that for Forethought as well. And somewhere in there, I think you and Arden maybe like read up on
these posts are good.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have hired Luisa.
Well, maybe not at the time. I guess kind of dream come true. You ended up writing, and a couple of years after I'd originally trialed, you made the job offer. So that was a year ago, and then I only just started because I think at the time you made the job offer, I had been RAing for Will, who is writing a new book on long-termism, and felt like doing that for a full year was a valuable thing to do.
By Will, you mean Will MacAskill, of course?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I stuck with that, and now, finally, 3 years later, made it here.
Yeah. How do you feel about the decision to keep working on the book?
I mean, I definitely feel good. I think the book is hopefully going to be impactful and important and persuade lots of people of long-termism. And it definitely was like, I guess there was like clearly urgent stuff to be done at 80K. But yeah, I think me working on the book for that year, as opposed to like Will having to scramble to hire someone new during a kind of very busy period when we knew we kind of worked really well together, and that the 80K stuff could probably wait, ended up feeling kind of right. And then I also just think I think I'll learn a lot at 80K, but I think I learned a ton about specific content matter and got exposed to more different kind of flavors of long-termism. So I just feel like much better informed than maybe I would have if I'd just been 8K. I'm not totally sure, but...
Yeah, I was sad you couldn't come join right away, but I guess, prepping for this interview, I've got to read some of the book, and I'm really enjoying it. It's very fun, and I think it might well be a big hit. So that was probably a year well spent, making it even better.
Yeah, I hope so.
It seems like it would have been very hard for Will to find someone at your level.
Well,
who's already like deep in the topic.
And I think Will and I
left him in the lurch.
Right. Yes, I think we knew we worked well together, and we just had momentum, and I'm glad we kept that going.
All right. So the big thing we're here to talk about is this series of articles you've written, I guess, in part, but not exclusively for the book that Will's writing, on the probability of humanity ultimately recovering and building back from a serious collapse of civilization. I guess, not many people have, as far as I know, kind of considered that in a sober way. It seems like an area where there's a lot of loose talk and maybe not a lot of hard talk. Yeah. How did you first get into this topic?
Yeah, exactly. I got into the topic because after thinking about nuclear war, where I'd done this big project thinking about whether a nuclear war would cause a nuclear winter and whether a nuclear winter could cause human extinction. And I ended up feeling like it causing human extinction was pretty impossible. It's just like really hard to tell a story of how that actually happens. Yeah, or I guess it still seemed bad to me if nuclear winter caused civilizational collapse. But then even when I reflected on that, collapse isn't necessarily as bad as human extinction, at least on its face. And then I realized I actually just had no idea if it was as bad as human extinction. I didn't know if it would necessarily lead to it. I didn't know if it was completely implausible that it would lead to it. And then it just started to feel like this gaping hole in a lot of these global catastrophic risks that get you part of the way to extinction. Lots of people die, and it's horrible. But I couldn't find any really plausible stories, at least right away, for thinking that it was as bad. And then that felt like maybe a reason to prioritize it a bit less. And so I guess Will and I had talked a bit about nuclear stuff, and we talked a bit about this in part because he was kind of forming some of his views in preparation for his book on long-termism, where I guess whether civilization could recover from collapse, but not an extinction event, felt important to him in trying to figure out what to actually recommend long-termists work on.
Okay, yeah. So I guess he had to figure out how worried to be about things like nuclear war, or I guess very bad climate change, or I suppose even like a massive traditional war or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because... Yeah, so this question has floated around for a while, as far as I know. People have been like, hey, if half of people died in a pandemic, would that lead to the collapse of civilization?
Right.
And you're like, I guess it doesn't seem like it would. And then they'll chat about it at lunch.
Exactly.
And then that's kind of the level that it'll get to. And people will be like, I don't really see why it would. And I guess you can push it on further. Like, what if 99% of people died in some sort of pandemic? Like, would we rebuild? And it seems like, it doesn't seem like there's any reason why we wouldn't. But that was the... It wasn't going beyond like lunchtime conversation very much. And then finally, this provided the opportunity for someone to spend like actual months looking into this and thinking through the different issues at stake. Yeah,
I think that's right. I have a feeling that some people kind of thinking about grant making in EA, I think they had worked out views on this, but I'd never seen any, and they didn't feel public, and maybe they didn't feel well organized. So it felt like at least some value came from this thing being like organized in a I don't know if I'd say linearly, but organized a bit more and put in a public place so that people could talk about it.
Yeah. So when you started looking into it, and I guess asking people, did they have a Google Doc about this?
Right.
What was kind of the state of the literature?
Yeah, I never got a Google Doc shared with me. I did interviews with people who think a lot about global catastrophic risks to see if there just were like common stories. And yeah, I guess I got plenty of people like putting hypotheses forward, but no one pointing at papers or even like internal docs. And then there are like a couple of pieces of the puzzle that had been published actually just mostly outside of EA. So,
Well, I'm kind of curious to know. I would think that almost most of the conversation about this would be outside of the existential risk and like effective altruism communities, just because we're very small.
Right. Yeah. So there was some about climate change and like whether climate change would cause collapse. But again, it all felt very speculative. Like it felt like usually the best, or like not the best I found, was like think pieces.
Like new scientist level, not
exactly.
Yeah.
Like people like, I guess, saying plausible things, but no one having much evidence other than their like intuitions or something.
Yeah. There's the knowledge, right?
So that was, I think, one of the coolest things I found, which is like, again, just a piece of the puzzle. So what the knowledge by Lewis Dartnell did was just assume that there was a catastrophe where, I don't remember exactly if he assumed a certain percentage of the population died, but he assumed that infrastructure was left standing. I think maybe he hypothesized it could be something like a pandemic where potentially billions of people died. He kind of like lays out this catastrophe scenario. And then the rest of the book is basically going through all the pieces of information individuals and groups would need to have to rebuild. First, very basic needs. So basic forms of agriculture. How to purify water. Just like survival. And then goes progressively through like, how do we get to the rudimentary versions of the technologies we have today? So it even goes to like, how do you make fertilizer using certain types of rocks and chemistry? So it's like, it ends up kind of giving you the information you'd need that's kind of beyond survival, but also pre-industrial. I mean, it's mainly, I think, just meant to be very interesting. But I think theoretically, he liked the idea that if someone found it in the post-catastrophe society, or if someone had intentionally, put it somewhere, people would at least survive. Or maybe in addition to that, be able to recreate photography and other rudimentary technologies.
Yeah. It seems like the kind of question where, I don't know, I feel like if I ask someone random on the street, do you think that like any academic, like some researcher somewhere has spent a lot of time looking at this question of if 99% of people died in a war or pandemic or whatever, that humanity would rebuild? It's like a glaringly obvious question, especially you'd think during the Cold War or something like that, when people were talking about nuclear winter. But it seems like it's just kind of fallen through the cracks a bit. I guess there's no university department for like disaster apocalypse studies. That sounds a bit silly to them somehow. And it's like no one's particular responsibility. It's not the earth sciences people's responsibility or the physicists or the engineers even. Yeah, that's
a really good point. I did come across, I think it's Princeton has a kind of interdisciplinary working group that has conferences every once in a while. The acronym is PIIRS. It's definitely trying to think about collapse studies, and it brings in physicists, but it is, one, just not at all very practical, and two is, I think it's not actually thinking about reasons collapse might lead to extinction. It's more like, might the power grid go offline if there's like a certain level of war or pandemic or something? And I guess it's more on this question that is like, what kind of catastrophe would cause a collapse, and not on whether humanity would survive or recover from a collapse itself.
I see. More focused on the first step, and then
exactly.
Like, less,
then just like nothing on the second that I found.
I guess there's not much business value in it, is there? Like, I guess you have like lots of Goldman Sachs, like business analysts trying to figure out like what companies are good, but there's just not much money to be made, I guess, in forecasting what would happen after all of the bank accounts are empty.
And just like, it is really intractable. I mean, it's not totally intractable, but it's hard to like,
you feel a bit lost, I suppose. You feel used to more rigorous things.
It is. I imagine a physicist being like, I don't know how concretely I can say very true things about this. I'll just be guessing.
I feel like economists might have the boldness and the arrogance to comment on it.
Maybe
that's true? Or did economists have much to say? Or not especially?
Not really.
Okay, no. Oh, well. Do you reckon there's classified military stuff? Because, I mean, the US government has this interesting continuity of business plan where they're trying to figure out, like, if Washington, D.C. is wiped off the map, where are they going to send everyone to keep doing their business? I think, like, a very high priority for them is getting people to pay taxes again very quickly, which is quite funny, but because it is necessary, so...
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised, especially Cold War era. And then I would guess that it kind of bottomed out at the level where you still have governance. So maybe they're like really going to be trying to tax people again quickly. But if you, as some people think you might, lose that level of governance, then I would guess like...
It's not a plan.
It's not, yeah. They're not planning for like, when there's no leadership.
Yeah, when we're back to pre-industrial, or like when we're back to agricultural or subsistence agriculture.
Exactly. Then what should the former Americans who are no longer members of a state do?
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting, right? So I had the sense that there's tons of fiction or like lots of science fiction stuff on this, which is like some of it might be a bit harder and some of it might be a bit more fantastical. But I guess like, have the creative writers maybe done the most cutting edge research on this?
I think probably. I mean, to be fair, it's like... any work on this will be kind of imaginative by its nature. So that probably is just some of the best work that can be done. And these are some of the people best at imagining kind of like weird worlds. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's plenty on it. It's very interesting. I read sci-fi about post-apocalypse.
What's good?
Ooh, what's really good?
It feels like you want something like The Martian, where it's like actually trying to figure, someone who has engineering experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I actually think this is not sci-fi, but I think the knowledge he's like a chemist and physicist, Lewis Dartnell. So I think he really was coming at it from a scientific perspective. But so I definitely had some books that I really liked. I don't know that any of it felt like, oh yeah, this is what would happen.
Finally, the answer.
They've solved it.
Yeah.
But I mean, The Road is very dark.
I decided not to watch that.
Yeah.
I just want to watch happy things.
Yeah. I mean, I used to like this topic more until I started having to think about the fact
what
that
it would be
this,
like.
Yeah. And like...
Yeah, what in The Road, are there any insights that you can remember that are fun to mention? Because it focuses a lot on food access, right?
Yeah, it does. Which is, I think, common and like mostly what comes up when people actually like really try to think of ways or like how extinction happens. I don't know if there's anything particularly fun from The Road.
Okay, sorry. A broad sense of fun.
Yeah, very broad
sense
of fun. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so basically in lots of fiction about post-apocalyptic worlds, one of the main drivers of plot is conflict between groups. And I guess it's just not as interesting a book to read about people slowly starving to death. Where,
cooperatively.
Like, yeah, exactly. Like all trying to...
Well, the happier story would be like people banding together to make bigger groups in order to cooperate, in order to reestablish agriculture. Where you're like, well, the more people, like the more agriculture we can do and the more we can specialize.
Right.
Which I guess could be interesting, but it's like that. It sounds like a harder book to write than a story about people fighting.
Yeah, it definitely has less obvious plot dynamics and ways to draw people in.
All right. Well, enough about fiction. We're going to try to do better than that. Get onto the substance of these different kind of sub-questions that you've tried to get through. So, I guess in part we want to like share some of the historical examples that you've dug up and like various other considerations that people have raised that you've tried to be like, really, is this right? Like what actually is it when you think about this more analytically? But I suppose you've worked on this for about a year, right?
Yeah, about a year, half time.
Yeah. So this is like not the most exhaustive possible research project that someone could do and hopefully other people will come along and do more.
Yeah, exactly.
But it seems like the broad story is you've gone out looking for stories that people could tell, like some explanation for why these things would cause us to go extinct and kind of come up a bit empty. You just keep finding that they're not that persuasive. The narrative isn't that compelling. And so you're not saying it's impossible that this stuff could happen. You're just like, no one's explained why. So it's a bit of like the unknown unknowns are maybe the thing that is most problematic.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A couple of things seem like the most likely options, but mostly like, especially surprising to me was the fact that the really common explanations people would give, like starvation, violence, just never ended up. I was like, okay, let me just concretely make this into a story. And it just felt like there's no story that made any sense.
It falls apart in your hands.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess my hope is that people will listen to this and come away with the sense that well, it seems like lots of people have been scared away from this topic from the fact that not many people have looked into it.
Yeah,
Maybe they thought it, so maybe at least some of them thought it was a hopeless enterprise, that how can you think about something that's so different from what we have now? But I think like reading your stuff, I'm like, no, people can think about this. You can interrogate the specific claims that people make, or like think about these stories. And sometimes it's just sufficiently clear that they don't make sense, that you can make progress, or at least like your forecasts of things can move up and down pretty substantially with some thought.
Yeah, that is how I felt. I definitely, like you said, don't feel like I settled any of these questions, but I at least felt like I went from, I don't know, some of these things seem plausible to like, you can force it if you want, but most of the explanations I was coming up with didn't feel so solid that I felt like I could even endorse the previous position I had, which was like, maybe. So I think I at least moved from like, maybe, who knows, to like, I don't know. Like, sure, maybe in a way that, like you said,
Can't
is
rule it
unknown
out.
unknowns. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can't rule anything out. But everything I've come up with feels kind of flimsy.
All right. Well, with that in mind, what sort of different disasters did you analyze?
Yeah, so I found that it did kind of matter, the type of disaster that you're talking about, to how likely it is that civilization would even collapse, but then also to how likely it is that civilization would recover from collapse. So I tried to take a few examples, just to keep the scope narrow enough to even think about, that got at some of the key parameters or something of a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite hit all of the ones I wanted. But the main three I considered were a scenario where 50% of the population dies. Like you can imagine it as a pandemic. So you have high population loss, not extremely high, but much higher than, for example, COVID, but then no loss of
physical infrastructure. The houses are still here.
Yeah. And aside from the fact that basically like the climate is the same and like there are kind of no lasting environmental effects too. So that's kind of one case where you're just like toggling up and down on population death. Another that I thought about was adding in infrastructure damage. And because nuclear war seems like kind of a plausible catastrophic risk, I went ahead and just tried to think about nuclear winter in particular. So for that one, I thought the parameters would be something like maybe 90% population death through both kind of the initial war and then famine in the very immediate aftermath of the nuclear winter. And then I also thought there would be something like 5 to 10 years of environmental effects, but then those would go away. So that was another one. And then the last one I thought about was I was trying to come up with basically a set of catastrophes that might make the story look worse. And yeah, for the thing that I've actually written up and posted, I ended up thinking about nuclear war and biological weapons. And so in that scenario, I ended up assuming that population death would be much higher, so 99.99%, which I think leaves you with 800,000.
Okay, so 800,000 people left globally. Yeah.
Yep. And then I also, you still had the infrastructure damage and you still had the environmental effects that were temporary. And so that was one of the worst cases I could think of. And then one that I've kind of thought about since writing publicly about the topic, so maybe a fourth one, is what happens if you have a nuclear war that kills lots of people, but then you also have climate change or like climate effects that do last for a really, really long time, on the order of like not a decade, but thousands of years.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the kind of main like parameters I see being important. Ended up being how many people die, whether like stuff is left standing, so infrastructure is standing, whether there are environmental effects and how long all of these effects kind of last.
Yeah, nice. So I guess, so there's a number of people dead, there's the infrastructure destruction, and there's like how long is the environmental damage lasting? Yeah. I guess, that adds a lot of permutations, and we can't, I guess in your essays, various documents, you like go through all of these and think about the various different kinks of each one, but we can't be quite as thorough here. So we're going to have to be a little bit more broad brush, but I guess people can go away and read the documents that we'll link to if they want to like be more precise. Don't at me. Are there any kind of facts about what the world would look like after some of these disasters that are non-obvious, that are kind of useful to keep in mind when we're visualizing the situation that people would face?
Yeah, I do think there are a few. So kind of regardless of the scenario, a thing that kept coming up as important was the fact that catastrophes will kind of inevitably be non-uniform in their effects. So I guess if you have a catastrophe that's so big that it's actually uniform in its effects and it's really severe, it's going to kill everyone. So that would be like a catastrophe like an asteroid that actually really impacted the Earth, or maybe actually like...
It's like even bigger than the one that killed the dinosaurs or something like that.
Yeah. So that is one where you can imagine having consistent mortality rates everywhere, consistent climate effects everywhere. But for the catastrophes that interest us, so the ones that don't actually kill everyone at once, but leave some survivors, the reason that happens is because the catastrophe is going to have non-uniform effects. And I think for lots of catastrophes, they could just be very non-uniform, where like you might get some entire continents that are much, much less affected than others, both in terms of population death and in terms of climate effects. So an example, a nuclear winter that's kind of well known is you have some continents where agriculture becomes near impossible, and then you have others where it's like maybe even a bit better.
Because it's colder, or...?
Because it's colder and otherwise was too hot for agriculture.
I see. Before,
yeah. And that's like probably mostly you wouldn't get better. You'd just get...
it wouldn't be quite as devastating
as
elsewhere.
It would still, be possible. And then you get the same for pandemics. Maybe in pandemics, it's more for like political reasons. But like even thinking about the COVID variation.
Well, I guess you have islands, right? Or
yeah,
exactly. About, New Zealand, or I guess
great.
like other small islands. I guess... if something's very contagious, it could be quite hard. But that's the case where maybe it would be more uniform. But you'd think in a scenario where half of people were dying of a disease, that at least if it was a respiratory disease, we've kind of learned that if you're willing to be insanely strict about forcing people to stay at home, then it seems like you can suppress a disease. And people would be very motivated to stay at home, like maybe almost to a fault. Potentially, it could be problematic that people are unwilling to go out and do anything.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you make a couple of assumptions about the type of pathogen, it's just really hard to get the kind of transmission rates to stay high enough to really keep killing people. Given
that people will respond.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I guess also people thin out, right? So that's one problem that the disease starts facing.
You just won't encounter as many people if it's a human-to-human transmissible.
So this is why I guess you get to the case where 90% of people are dead, and then I guess we've just seen this with other pandemics, even very contagious ones, that they tend to burn out after a while. And I guess we've never actually had a pandemic. Well, it was the very worst was all of the diseases going to the Americas.
Yeah, exactly.
Where I think we don't know exactly how many people died, but it wasn't more than 90%.
No, I think there are some high estimates that are maybe as high as 90%, but they're for like communities.
Rather than the whole continent.
Yeah. So I think for some islands, they might have been that high. And even then, the data we have on that is just horrendous.
Yeah. And I guess with nukes as well, so Europe would be in a pretty bad situation in London. But New Zealand, again, there's damn New Zealanders.
I know.
They'll be having a great time. Wow.
They've got it all. Yeah. So they'll be fine with the pandemic. They'll be fine from the nuclear war.
What are the other scenarios? It's like conventional war. I guess we can consider that almost just a subset of the nuclear war. It's like not as bad.
So yeah. I think different types of climate change will kind of be differentially affecting.
I guess, so people talk about how climate change could potentially be good for Siberia or for places that are really far north and far south.
Very cold.
And so again, I guess New Zealand might be all right.
Yeah.
Or
New
I guess
Zealand
like otherwise
ends up looking
Russia
really good.
Okay,
Russia too. Well, in some of them. Sometimes Russia does well, sometimes it doesn't. But
I guess, so this non-uniformity is super central if you're thinking about, will it kill 100% of people? Because it's even if there's just like 1% of people living in some place that's largely unaffected, then that basically answers the question for you.
Exactly. And I think sometimes it's slight non-uniformity that makes a bit of difference, maybe isn't decisive. So like with nuclear winter, you'll have some areas that are cold and some areas that are slightly less cold. But some, I think, catastrophes would cause extremely non-uniform effects where like even if you had really, really enormous population losses and kind of actually the collapse of society and political systems and all of these systems that we think of as critical collapsed on one continent, I think you might see society continue on others. And I think that's something that I didn't intuitively have in my head when I first started thinking about this, is just some places might really be kind of unfazed.
Right. Thinking about New Zealand again, because I guess I suppose there's also Tasmania. Are there any other things that we should have in mind? I guess it's like Pacific Islands.
Pacific Islands. Yeah, I think depending on the thing again, In some scenarios, you really want coastlines because fishing is like a key source of food. So like Chile looks kind of good in a couple of scenarios. I think those are the main ones.
So let's maybe focus on the nuclear winter one first. So you get like massive nuclear exchange. I guess like in order to really get the worst cases, we have to imagine sometime in the future when there's many more nukes on high alert than is currently the case. Because we're, I guess, compared to the Cold War, there's like, I think a tenth as many nukes, maybe even less than that, on like high alert to actually be used. Because there's been various agreements.
Yeah, I think there was something in like 70,000 range, and now there's something in the 10,000.
Yeah. Oh, 10,000?
Oh, I think worldwide.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
US, it's something like 2,000. And Russia too.
Okay, so like a worse nuclear war than would be possible right now. In that case, as I understand it, the kind of the dust or all of the stuff they're worried about causing the nuclear winter doesn't spread very easily to the southern hemisphere, right? It kind of like maybe a bit trickles down there, but it's a lot less. And I suppose also if you're a coastal area or a place that has a lot of water around, then your temperature change is like much reduced because you have this stock of something that doesn't change temperature very easily, and it keeps you at about the same level.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right.
And how much would New Zealand suffer from the inability to import stuff? I guess they don't have an oil industry, right? And so their cars might stop working, or they won't be able to get replacement computers, I suppose. So that could be awkward.
Yeah, so very specific things like computer chips that are only made in some places, especially, will be impossible to get. And then probably things like fossil fuels will be harder for them to get. I tried to make kind of a predictive index that looked at a bunch of different features or like facts about a country or a continent and like score them on how good they looked. And one of the criteria was whether they were net importers or net exporters. And New Zealand was quite net importing. So that did make it look worse. Australia is very net exporting.
Oh, what kinds of things? Well, I guess coal, right? So that's a lot of coal.
Yeah, plenty of coal. And they net export food. So I would think I was especially interested in like some very basic necessity things to start. And Australia is great on
a bunch of them.
A bunch, including, they also are like net exporting on different energy sources.
Oh, Australia doesn't have much oil, right? But I guess it has gas.
It does have gas.
I see. Yeah.
I don't know actually about oil, but...
Okay. Do we have any indications of, like, would the New Zealand political system hold up? Or do we still have Prime Minister Jessica Ardern in the post-apocalyptic hellscape? Oh,
great question. Yeah. I mean, I would be musing about that.
Yeah.
Which I can try.
If you want to, yeah. I suppose, I don't know, my intuitive thing is, like, I'm not sure why not.
Exactly. I mean, it would be, I think, in the population's interest to, like, continue to be supported by the state and all the things the state provides, including like defense to other countries. And then also, I don't know if it's like maintaining infrastructure, but like, all of the things that keep things going. Like the state is so involved that people should want it to exist. And so I guess the main reason I think it might fall apart is like if they were invaded.
I see. Interesting. So other people wanted to come to New Zealand because it's so good.
That's all that's coming to mind. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like during disasters, I guess especially in the situation with New Zealand, where you're like, well, we're still fed and things are still running and like nobody in particular has died. We just don't have imports, and now we're going to have like a very rough time for like many decades, possibly centuries, as like the world rebuilds.
Right.
It seems like in that kind of situation, people tend to pull together. If anything, it's like you could see it like improving like approval ratings and like people's interest in like coordinating.
Yeah, you'd think if everyone knew that the status quo was in their favor, where like everywhere else in the world was doing terribly, but they'd like managed to keep things together, it would be not in their favor to like try to mix things up. But like, I suppose maybe if leadership were seen as doing something really irresponsible, maybe they'd get opposition. But even then, it seems like maybe there'd be a transition of power. But like, it's hard to imagine New Zealand
what's the
being...
coup? Or like, why do people support a coup? Or
like an actual...
Or like, I guess disintegration is more troubling. But again, it's,
Yeah, maybe there'd be a coup and like no one would be that excited about a bunch of violence. Like, so either it would work and hopefully not be super violent or not. But disintegration, like you said, it seems really hard to imagine why anyone would support action. Because it's just like they're in a reasonably good place.
Okay, all right. So this was all under the umbrella of non-uniformity of the impacts. Are there any other kind of important salient facts that people should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think kind of still under that umbrella, but a bit more specific. So some types of things that might stick around depending on the catastrophe. So there are like food stocks in different countries. The US is known for having a lot. Lots of countries have food stocks. And that's like grain and grain silos. And there are also, you have all sorts of infrastructure that has goods that will be sitting in it. And some of them will rot, but some of them won't. So you'll have kind of, if you're in a scenario where you have infrastructure, which I think some places would when you have this non-uniformity, then at least some populations will still just have access to like to stuff. Maybe not to like ongoing production of stuff, but to some stuff.
Okay, so we got food in supermarkets, we've got food in the warehouses that supply supermarkets. I guess we have food in the fields that's potentially still growing or could be harvested.
Yep.
So have livestock that are still alive. Yeah, what other kind of supplies do we have?
Yeah, so there are like really basic ones. It gets kind of specific, but if you have grocery stores, you have access to either actual yeast colonies or like alcohol with yeast in them, and that helps you if you're just trying to make your own yeast. That would be kind of hard, but if you wanted to make bread eventually, then you'd have access to places where you could get yeast, or even things just like warm clothes do wear out very quickly, and if it's really cold, you want to wear a lot to get durable and warm clothes. Like all sorts of things can be used to purify water.
Yeah, what do you use to purify water?
You can use iodine tablets, which you can get in like some kind of specific places, but you can also build your own water purification systems. You can even just leave clear plastic bottles in the sun for long enough, and that will kind of work until the water bottle starts to degrade.
I see.
So
can you use a normal water bottle for that? Can I go grab a bottle of Coke and empty it out and then fill it with water and stick it in the sun?
I think that the answer is yes for a bit. Okay. And then if you use it for a really long time, you'd start to maybe get cancer.
That's tomorrow's problem.
Exactly. Yeah, okay. You'll already have cancer from the radioactive fallout.
Okay, so we've got the water stuff, clothes, food. I guess a super salient thing here is how many survivors are there? Because if...
Totally.
It's a funny one where I guess you get this balancing thing where if like almost everyone's dead, then they've got an enormous amount of stuff to use. And if almost everyone's alive, then I guess you have a lot more resources to try to keep producing stuff. Yeah. But your stockpiles are not going to last very long. Yeah.
Which I think is just like, was a really interesting emergent finding is like, number of survivors really does interact in a kind of funny way with other things where, I think this applies to things beyond just like supplies left. So supplies left is a good example where if you have lots of survivors, the supplies go very quickly. But then on the other hand, if you have lots of people dying, which would be terrible in some respects and makes it a bit harder to rebuild industry and harder to make sure that ideally that you'd keep some of the necessary knowledge and skills you'd want to at least eventually rebuild industry. When you are down to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, it's like less guaranteed that you'll keep all of those skills. And so you just get these kind of trade-offs. And I think mostly I felt like it worked in favor of survival.
Okay, so this kind of relates to this concept that you have called the grace period, which I think you got from the knowledge, right?
I did. Yeah.
So I guess the grace period is this temporary time after some disaster where a bunch of people are now dead, but I guess you had this overhang of supplies from the pre-apocalypse world, and I guess other things like cars are around, like other infrastructure. So this like potentially helps you to stick around and then rebuild. Yeah, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So again, it's kind of depends on the catastrophe, but at least in some places, in most catastrophe scenarios, you have maybe all of the infrastructure that you did otherwise. You have a power grid that still exists, even if it's not working. You have grocery stores with food in them. You even have petrol stations that still have petrol in them and that you can siphon out pretty easily. So you have things that mean that you can kind of survive in a reasonably easy and accessible way. And just how long that period lasts, again, depends on how many people there are. But I think you'd be kind of surprised how much stuff you can still access, with the limitations being like the power grid will stop working. But like Even water will still run for at least a while, and even maybe for a long while in some places where the water supply isn't run by electricity and
gravity.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess you face, so the more people you have, more people you have to try to rebuild stuff, but the less supplies you have per person. And then like the reverse in the other case, if most people are dead, then you're potentially short of like the expertise perhaps that you might need to get things running, but the grace period is longer. Yeah. Is it more of like giving a sense of like how long it is, or like what kind of stuff might we run out of first?
So if you have 50% population loss, I think that theoretically, if you actually allocated all of the food and water, kind of literally rationed it, then it would only last days, like under a week.
Oh, wow. Really?
So that's if
this is supermarket food or something.
This is supermarket food and grain stocks.
Really?
Yeah.
So little. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, lots of countries have them and some countries don't. And so if you actually just divide like the US, China, some of the really big food suppliers, like over everyone.
Yeah.
We used to have many more, or like a much greater volume of food stocks than we do now, especially during the Cold War, kind of unsurprisingly. But currently, lots of countries have about 6 months of grain reserves, and then lots have basically none. And so it seems to come out to a week or a couple of weeks for grain.
Okay. But I guess, so that means that then if you have a situation where 99% of people suddenly die, then now you can last years with that kind of food.
Yeah. So it's years if you make a few assumptions about how you prioritize the ordering, basically, in which you eat things. So you'll like have to consider perishability. And at some point...
It seems like people would do that.
It seems like they
extent.
would. Yeah. I mean, in the first couple of days, they'll probably like...
eat whatevs.
Go into the pasta before the like tomatoes, which would be a mistake. But it will probably not be the factor that determines whether they survive the catastrophe. But it's basically like eat the perishables first. And then at some point in the year's timescale, things rot and you can't eat them anymore. So that's actually the limit you hit before just like food per person.
Right. In the scenario where lots of people are,
most people have died and there are like thousands of survivors left. Like at some point, the grain will just not be edible anymore.
Is there anything you can do to make it last a lot longer? Stick it somewhere really cold underground?
Yeah, really cold, I guess. Yeah, or like process it.
Dry it.
Dry it, yeah. Which is... I suppose I hadn't really thought about this, but like there's tons of livestock in some countries. And I suppose I'd actually just assumed that once we ate what we could kind of immediately, we'd lose a lot of edible biomass. But I suppose if there were like a campaign to like dry all of this meat right away, maybe that's more salvageable. So that would make it even more, that would make it look better.
Yeah. What other stuff might be in short supply?
Yeah. So... certain medications will run out super quickly, which most people don't actually rely on medications to live, so wouldn't be definitive. Yeah, power would be gone almost immediately, except in a few places that have really well-designed hydroelectric dams. And then GPS apparently would survive a couple of days, but then the satellite's orbits would slowly start shifting out of place. So GPS would stop being accurate.
Do people have cars? Do cars still work?
Yeah, so cars will work. They'll eventually break down as they would in normal times. Gas, like diesel gas, lasts about 10 years if it's just sitting under a gas station. Non-diesel gas, the gas that most cars run on, lasts more like 5, at which point it degrades. And technically you could make it usable again, but you'd have to like...
It'd be hard.
Be a chemist.
Okay.
Yeah. And like, do some chemistry. But then you could pretty easily for the first basically 5 years run cars by either figuring out how to generate power to power gas stations or siphoning it out kind of more mechanically. You could just pull the gas out, put it in the cars would run until the things broke down. And then even then you'd have plenty of people mixing parts to keep cars running for even longer.
Yeah, I guess there's case studies of this, right? Because there's various countries where I suppose like Myanmar, like Cuba, places that had
Cuba's import
restrictions.
Yeah, exactly.
Where they did manage to keep cars running for a surprisingly long time.
Yeah, exactly. And it did rely on kind of like mechanics in Cuba. It's like more prestigious to be a mechanic in Cuba because it's like a really valuable skill set to like be able to keep them running.
So basically, I suppose they combine cars over time, I guess, by like combining the working parts of each of them and then find other replacement things that aren't exactly the part that was originally intended, but keep the car moving.
Yeah. And I think things that get hard are like tires. You'll have tires for a long time, but once you do run out of tires, it's extremely hard to make tires from rubber. But a lot of other things you could plausibly...
They didn't used to use, or like originally, I don't think we used rubber tires. We used like stuff that was full of hay, or I don't know. It was like weird sorts of tires. I mean, they were very unpleasant, I think, because they had no bounce in them. But
yeah, good point. And I don't know how hard it would be to retrofit a car with some like non-rubber tires, but maybe we'd have cars even longer than I thought.
Yeah. Do electric cars keep running without the internet?
Yeah, I can't think of a reason they wouldn't. I don't actually know that much about electric cars.
Yeah, I think they're meant to like break down a lot less, so they might have that benefit. I suppose it might be harder to get electricity than access to oil.
I think so. Yeah. I think it would be. Though like another case where we see real ingenuity is in, again, places that have seen a lot of conflict. So during the Serbian bombing of Bosnia, there were cities that were completely isolated from the rest of the world for a period of years while they were being basically attacked and like supplies were being like restricted. And people generated electricity by pulling engines out of cars and putting them into rivers in a way that like created like a water.
Oh, wow. They turned them into hydropower.
Yeah, exactly. But then also just by pulling generators out of just a bunch of different appliances that have generators in them and then jury rigging them to other things to just...
Do you know how they got fuel?
I don't know. I can guess like where I would think to get fuel now that I've like read about this, but I don't actually know in that scenario what they were doing there.
I guess, in the future, it seems like if there's tons of solar panels all over the place, that could be a big advantage here.
Yeah.
I suppose it will be very intermittent, but that's like not the key issue if you're trying to like charge a phone. I don't know. I can imagine phones, at least in some places, being like surprisingly important, or like, I guess, basic food cooking or something like that.
Totally. Yeah. And solar panels, I think they definitely degrade. I think they degrade at a rate of like 1% efficiency loss per year, which just gets you a lot of time.
Not so bad, yeah. Yeah. I think that I've definitely read that some solar panel manufacturers are insuring their things for like failure up to 30 years now.
Wow.
Which some people are skeptical. They think that this might be a bad move because they're going to fail. But they feel cocky about the the performance of their solar panels. So maybe they are getting up to a level of technological sophistication where they could last quite a while.
Cool. Yeah. That will be helpful. So there would be ways to generate power and people would probably figure them out because people have really diverse skills. This is now just an aside, but I do think one thing, this like kind of fallacy I had when starting this project was like, I wouldn't know how to do any of this stuff. So like we'd be doomed. And then the issue here is that I don't know how to do almost anything, but lots of other people do have many clearer, harder skills than I do. Like I'm probably at the bottom percentile of like useful skill sets in the apocalypse.
It's possible that you know something that you haven't recognized how useful it might be.
Yeah. But just because I can't,
people are going to need career advice in the post-apocalyptic.
There you go. They're going to need.
I recommend that you become the engine hydro converter guy.
I at the very least will know that it's possible, and that will be helpful.
Yeah. Well, actually, you have really useful skills now.
Yeah. Knowing what's possible did feel like an important consideration.
Yeah. It seems like another thing is it's easy to underestimate how hard people try when their lives are on the line to do stuff, how many things they will try. Are there other examples that you can think of that? I
mean, I also had this intuition of like, I couldn't possibly grow food. But of course I could figure out how to grow food. Yeah. There are a couple of things. Like, not everyone would be able to figure out how to grow food. And there are some random facts that you need to know or figure out. So, for example, most people don't know that you can't just take crops that are grown in the fields and get viable plants from them. They just don't produce seeds.
Is that true everywhere? Or just about?
It's basically like 99% of agriculture doesn't produce viable seeds.
Seems bad.
Bad.
Well, what can you do?
So you'd have to know that like heirloom crops produce seeds.
Where do they get the seeds from now? Are there special laboratories where they make the seeds that work?
It's like genetically modifying plants to be super productive also means modifying them to not waste energy on making
reproduction.
Seeds. Yeah, on reproduction.
Oh, so it's not like some Terminator thing where they're trying to protect patents. It's that they've engineered them to not produce anything other than the food.
It's probably a mix.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, they might be happy as well if you have to keep buying the thing. But...
Yeah, I think that is part of it.
So farmers currently get it from special places that produce the seeds that they use.
Yeah, and I guess you get new seeds every year.
Okay. And they must have some like precursor plants that are producing these seeds. So you could potentially get them and then... Yeah,
so you could get them. I mean, like when I was doing this project, had an urgent get list on my phone. That was just like, in the event of an apocalypse, the first things I would get included heirloom seeds. You can get them from gardening stores. You can get them from lots of places. It would be much more niche than like getting water or like existing food. But if you knew to get it, you'd be able to.
Yeah. And I guess one scenario you might imagine is, there's people like you who go and like grab all the heirloom seeds and then go and like run their farm and leave everyone else to die. But you would actually need a whole lot of other people. You'd be like leading a whole team of people to go and do it, right? So like one person who knows this could probably, at least if it was possible to find other people, then it seems like the more the merrier by and large with this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's other examples of people being like super clever in various things you've read. I guess, so another one with Cuba is they...
Good one.
Okay, so Cuba keeps coming up, huh? Yeah. So with the fall of the Soviet Union, they like lost their access to lots of fertilizer and trucks that they were using for agriculture and stuff like that. And rather than like sit on their hands, they realized they weren't going to have trucks. So they bred tons of oxen in order to plow fields. Is that right?
Yeah, this is a wild story. So they did have, I forget how many years notice, maybe it was like just a year or two of notice that they were going to lose access to their main supplier of all of these key inputs to their agriculture system, their industrial agriculture system. And so they basically were like, we won't be able to make food unless we can. And for some reason, the main bottleneck was plowing fields, like you said. And so they spent years breeding oxen to manually.
They must have had a lot of oxen to start because you can only... Oxen can only make so many oxen, right?
Yeah. I don't know if that involved importing while they still could.
Yeah.
I don't know that part of the story.
So they managed to get like tens of thousands or something of the oxen. And then so I think they did have food rationing, and the 90s were not a great period for Cuba, but there was not mass starvation or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, the record is that it worked.
It largely worked. Okay.
They were massively less productive than they would have been with machinery, which is like unsurprising. Yeah. But they made food.
Yeah, another one is people in POW camps in World War II coming up with radios out of pencil graphite and like various wire that they found. I guess they knew more about how radios worked than perhaps like typical people did.
Right.
But they were managing to communicate and like listen to radio programs.
Yeah, exactly. I don't actually, off the top of my head, remember the precise materials they used to make these radios, but it was things like gum wrappers and pennies. Everyone kind of knew the like assembly instructions. And as far as I know, you could only listen. I don't remember anything. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that they were figuring out ways to broadcast, but not kind of like foot soldiers who were doing things like putting these radios together, both to get news and also just to like listen to music. And this was just like most people would do this. It wasn't hard. And that's another one where I'm like, what? A radio is magic. Surely you couldn't make one with random bits, but things are not magic.
Okay, considering less materials now, more like know-how, I suppose. So in the situations where there's far fewer people, like 99% of people dead or something like that, how much will we struggle to access knowledge about, say, medicine or other topics where it would be really potentially useful to remember stuff from the pre-apocalypse? Yeah.
So I suppose, luckily, there is kind of an inverse correlation between how valuable knowledge is and how few people have it. This isn't perfectly true. So there are some things that would be really useful for survivors to know, like what's a common one. I guess there are some weird things about telecommunications that like 6 people know. And so we'll probably lose those facts. But mostly, like, even though there are many fewer brain surgeons than general practitioners or something, brain surgery is just less important than all the knowledge that general practitioners have.
Yeah.
And that just like does a lot of work. So we'll lose lots of sophisticated knowledge of some types of medicine, but it's hard to imagine why we'd lose germ theory and even like some basic things that will make maternal health better during childbirth, for example. And even that will be a huge improvement on where our ancestors were at similar population levels.
Yeah. How many people know things like how to keep a car running or like how to run a power station? Maybe think about that, or like how to run the electrical grid or get that back up and running. Things that kind of stand out as maybe there's not enough people in that group.
Yeah. Those were good candidates for like, I called them critical skill sets. And I guess it's just kind of hard to think about. So one reason it's hard is like no single person knows how to run a power grid. It's like really distributed knowledge. And leadership at a plant might have more knowledge of the bigger picture, but it's still distributed not just in the many individuals who like know the different steps, but also it's going to be in like manuals, and some of those will survive. So it's hard to think of like really critical knowledge that's super concentrated in like a couple of people. And I try to do some back of the envelope calculations to be like, what is concentrated and what could we lose? And I would love for someone else to try doing this research in a way that produces more interesting results than what I did. I ended up doing things like maybe like we think advanced chemistry would be really nice to have. So I was like, how many PhD chemists are there? And try to think of it this way. And when you think of it that way and you just make some naive assumptions about where they live, you still have lots of PhD chemists, even in a world where 99% of people have died.
I guess it might be getting down if you're at the 99.99.
That's where you start to hypothesize. I think I just don't know enough about how critical infrastructure works to be like, what's the job? What's that one job that's like scarce but super critical? But you can think about it just kind of theoretically. Like maybe there are some jobs like that, and you do get to the like 99.99% population loss level before you start thinking that there are jobs like that you'll definitely lose.
Yeah. It could be an interesting thing to contract, I suppose, like a power grid company or someone who runs a power plant, or I guess like, British Telecom or whatever, to be like, imagine that like there's only two of you left in British Telecom. Like what could they get running in London? Like what could you get them to run?
I actually tried really hard to get in touch with power companies for this.
They weren't keen to chat?
They were not keen to chat.
Busy, okay.
They thought I was really weird, to be honest.
Oh, really? They thought you,
Yeah, I would like get to their media teams and be like, it's totally speculative questions, but would you be up for chatting? You don't even have to be on the record, and just no one wanted to. They thought it was really, really strange.
It feels like you need maybe some government resiliency office to get in touch with them and say like, we're doing a review of like critical infrastructure in like these cases. Like, can you explain like how resilient your stuff is?
Totally.
Yeah, my guess is they wouldn't initially know a lot of these questions. Well, like certainly a good thing where it's like, okay, now 99% of your staff aren't coming into work.
Yeah, exactly. And there are like, I know we talked about kind of how limited the research in this general area is, but there are some nonprofits that their mission is to improve resilience of critical infrastructure and to like point out weaknesses, basically. And I never found anything that felt super show-stopping in terms of like a thing that would be really hard to recreate or a thing that would be really hard to relearn or something. But probably those are the type of researchers that would come up with a better answer to this than I could.
Yeah. I suppose you could... like in a world where such a large fraction of the population is gone, like 99 and 99.99%, the infrastructure you need is wildly less ambitious than what we presently have. So in that scenario, now we're talking about only 6,000 people being alive in Britain, or like, I don't know, 600,000, let's say. So realistically, what you want is like one power plant back up and then like to connect it to one place where everyone's going to congregate, or at least like that's the place where you'll be doing the electricity and industrial stuff again.
Yeah. And that
seems a lot more plausible that it's like a few electrical people or a few people who knew about the power grid could go there and get like the least damaged power plant running and then connect it to this one city.
Right. Exactly. And it's another example of this trade-off between having more people versus fewer people. In this case, more people means you keep more of the power grid on, but fewer people means you just need way less sophisticated systems to create enough power.
Yeah. Did you learn anything about the internet, or how hard is it to get the internet running again?
Yeah. I felt pessimistic about the internet But I didn't look that hard into it because it didn't seem super critical.
Yeah, I suppose that's fair. I've heard that it was designed to survive a nuclear war. Or like, I hadn't heard this one. So originally, so you could have the internet be far more centralized, but the US, when they were designing it, originally it was for military purposes. They were like, no, we're going to like have it organically reroute everything based on like what is still running. So I think, for example, like New Zealand could have its own internet continuing without necessarily needing contact with the rest of the world.
Wow.
Maybe that's no longer true, or maybe like they will have messed something up and it would be in practice hard to keep it running. But it's designed to outlast a nuclear war originally.
That's so cool.
Yeah. I guess thinking about it, I suppose it seems like so many of the computers would be gone, or the computers would eventually break, and so I'm not sure how long like the internet would be like centrally useful. But maybe it would be quite useful for people to find one like in the initial stages to share information.
Yeah, exactly.
Could be quite key.
Yeah, I mean, even if you had one and printed things, that would be pretty good. Like just being able to selectively pick out things to keep indefinitely and put them somewhere deliberately and just have information.
Yeah. Printers famously last for years without technical problems, so we should be pretty secure there.
Yeah, that's got to be a new intervention, is making printers more robust.
What about water? You're saying in some places, I guess, water's stored in reservoirs and it comes down through gravity. Other places it's pumped. I guess the pumps are probably mega complex. But I guess water stands out for like you die quite fast with no water. So that's maybe even before food. That's the thing that you're struggling to get.
Yeah, I mean, so water, again, there's geographic non-uniformity. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So this, again, is a theme.
Yeah.
Some places will just have fresh water nearby. So that'll be like the easiest scenario. And it's really not very hard to, I mean, you can drink fresh water and not get super ill without doing anything to it. And then by doing a little bit more, you won't even get ill. And then if you are super unlucky and have no access to fresh, relatively clean water, then there are still... So I even did a back of the envelope calculation that was like, how long could people survive with just the water bottles in grocery stores, which is like not that long, but I didn't feel like the first thing people would be dying of was thirst. Water bottles feel like they buy you some time.
Yeah. I mean, we're mashing together lots of different scenarios here and just like thinking about like, water in general, what's the deal with water? But I guess it's like, so it's pretty different in the like climate change versus the nukes versus the pandemic.
Sure.
But yeah, continuing to mash them together. It seems like if water is your main concern, then you move to a place where there's more water. I suppose like Saudi Arabian desert is like maybe a challenging one, but there's like other places like in Britain where maybe there's places where there isn't a lot of fresh water, but there would be other places where it rains more. Right. It kind of rains a lot everywhere here, but you're closer to a reservoir or something.
Yeah, exactly. That was my answer to like several potential scary scenarios is like people will still move. Sometimes they will even move in cars and trucks. But at the very least, they will move on foot, maybe on bike.
Yeah. Maybe the cleanest one to imagine, or the easiest one to envisage to me is a pandemic goes through incredibly quickly. 99% of people die, but then the rest are left. They've either survived it or they're immune or the pandemic's gone away.
Yeah.
Now, so the infrastructure's all here. They've got quite a long time. In that case, I mean, they can go and look at all the maps and be like, all right, where's the reservoirs? Like, where's the main agricultural regions here? And then be like, where is the housing? And there's so many fewer of them that they could just go and occupy the places that seem most promising from a like reconstruction point of view.
Right.
And depending on how much is still working, you'd even try to get everyone in the country to like move to this region where you're like, hey, we've got the power station, we've got the water, we've got the food,
And even if things weren't working, they would be attractors whether or not they could communicate. And that's also just helpful because in a world where you lose lots of population, I guess, some people will start to worry about genetic diversity and like just keeping large enough groups to be able to keep growing new people.
I guess got all the single people. They haven't got Tinder anymore, so
how are they going to meet?
You have to go to the water reservoir to find a partner. Sorry.
Exactly. So there are going to be these attractors that are going to mean like people aren't randomly scattered across different land masses. They're going to be like really interested in getting to former cities or...
Yeah, let's talk about the finding one another thing for a minute. So I guess it's like being isolated is itself in a sense a threat. You're like, I'm alone, completely alone, or there's only 10 of us, and like we're really not qualified to be taking this on by ourselves. So like you consider that kind of like a challenge in general. You had this amazing stat about how concentrated human population is.
Yeah. So it turns out that 95% of the world's population lives on just 10% of its land area. So 7.5% of the land area could be home to millions or even billions of people.
Yeah. I guess I'm familiar with this as an Australian, where it's a huge continent, but then basically everyone lives in a handful of cities.
Yeah, exactly.
And I suppose globally, it's just like, it's a bit different, but it's not so different. So this thing of like someone having to trudge across Siberia in order to like find other people.
Yeah.
Even if like 99.99% of people are dead, you could imagine that major cities like London or I guess India and China, these places would be like potentially relatively crowded with the survivors.
Yeah, exactly. I think this gave me pause for a second when I was like, if people randomly meandered across continents, how probable would it be that they'd come across each other? And then I was like, no, they will be following roads and the roads will lead to cities and there aren't that many cities. And I think they'd just find each other pretty easily.
Yeah. I suppose it's something we haven't talked about, which is amazing, is this movie Threads. You haven't seen this one?
No.
Okay, right. So this is from the 80s. There was a pair of movies, actually, no, 3 of them, I think. One made in the Soviet Union, one made in the UK, one made in the US, which all detailed in like gruesome, realistic detail what would happen in the build up to a nuclear war. Then during the nuclear war, like most people die, and then there's a bunch of survivors, and then like what would they do in order to survive?
Right.
And in that situation, I suppose this was a case where the UK does especially bad in the nuclear war situation because of how concentrated it is. So both like the fallout and the direct blast kills a much larger fraction than in the US, for example.
That makes sense.
It also gets like very cold because of its location. So this isn't a great place to like last out the nuclear winter, unfortunately. Yeah. However,
80,000 hours should not have its offices here.
Right. But some of the in the movie, now this is kind of realistic. It's like they're broadcasting stuff outwards. So like, there's still radio towers that operate. And so they like basically send out mass messages being like, here's where to congregate. And like there's still food stocks. And basically the military takes them over and is like, you have to farm in order to, or you have to do work in order to produce food in order to get access to like the food supplies. Which is like a somewhat more aggressive scenario. I suppose in that case, they've like been building up to a war the whole time. So they kind of had a big plan for like what would they do in this case that involves the military very heavily.
Yeah. Which again, maybe they have.
Yeah, maybe that does exist. But yeah, basically people came together relatively rapidly. You even see people like crowding into hospitals like in the immediate like aftermath where obviously it's like most people can't be saved, but there is still like some ability to do medicine. Yeah, I can definitely recommend that. I mean, it's a brutal viewing. It's it actually like apparently helped to persuade Reagan and Gorbachev. I think they actually watched this and were like, this would be really bad. Right. The nuclear winter thing like seems rough. And they became more excited about arms control, both the result of the general thing about nuclear winter and then about the specific thing of playing out this scenario for people. And it had a big effect on public perception. It's kind of interesting that it's fallen out of public conversation. Right. But there's a bunch of stuff on Wikipedia about this episode where these movies were like all produced in quick succession. Right. And what effect they had on people. So some people might be disagreeing with that general take here because we have this like peace in the world, like everyone holds hands and gets together and like tries to cooperatively farm. And I think the typical story, as we were talking about, is more like people are at one another's throats or killing one another. It's like zombie apocalypse almost, where it's like the last person surviving like gets all the food supplies. Yeah, what reasons do we really have to think that people would strive to get along and find one another?
Yeah, I guess I do feel a bit peace and lovey when I talk about this, but it does just, I think you even pointed me to the research on how people react to crises. And it's like, according to like sociologists who have looked into post-crisis response. And again, this is hard to generalize from because it's not actually a case where maybe the world's going to end. It's like sociologists looking at how individuals and groups respond to like tsunamis and hurricanes. And it's just almost unanimously not violent. Like looting is a kind of like famous trope, but almost never happens. Same with people fighting over resources. I think it's like, it did feel intuitive to me that there'd be like lots of violence because people would be facing death. But not only does that not look like the case empirically, it also just doesn't look like it looks like a strategy that might help some individuals survive if you just think about it theoretically, but it really doesn't seem like a strategy that would be good for the majority of people to take on because most people will really benefit from cooperation that lets them grow more food. Like an individual will have a very hard time producing enough food for themselves. And like, there's a reason that we live in cities. It's because we specialize and like produce more stuff for the number of people. And so cooperation has these like clear benefits, especially in the context of agriculture. And insofar as like, there will be some selection for like survival strategies, it seems like lots of people would benefit from taking this cooperation-y strategy. and that there will be like some cheaters or people who use violence to get a bunch of resources. But on the whole, that's not going to be a very persistent survival strategy.
Yeah.
Because you've got to have someone to steal from.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So yeah, I think I've like given something like this rant on the show before, where it's, people have this perception, and you heard this in like February, March, like April last year. Some people were like, oh, there's going to be a crime wave because of COVID-19, or like people are going to be at one another's throats over all of this stuff. Because in the US, you got political polarization over some things like wearing masks, but that kind of seems to be about as far as it went. Like actually crime went down in most places.
Yeah.
The level of coordination and cooperation and frankly self-sacrifice in order to contain the pandemic was much larger than I think folk wisdom would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, there was some hoarding that, like, I did buy more toilet paper than I wish I had.
Just goes to show that you would, like, shove a knife into the person next to you in the post-apocalyptic world not to get
those are
access to toilet paper. Yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like we have this empirical fact about that. Are there other, like, case studies that we can point to where people cooperated to a surprising extent? I mean, this is partly about cooperation, but about other things as well. But the story of Hiroshima is interesting.
Totally. Yeah. So both Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered, I mean, just horribly. I don't think I fully understood before looking into the details, but basically a third of the population died. I think the population started around 400,000. And I think maybe a quarter of those people died instantly. And then another set of tens of thousands of people died from kind of radiation poisoning in the weeks after. So that already was horrible, of course, and shocking to learn, and especially to learn about the details. And then, I just remember being really surprised that 90% of the city's buildings were either totally incinerated or reduced to rubble. So just like this huge infrastructure loss. And then at the same time, I also learned that the recovery was just shockingly quick. So if you think, I mean, the analogy doesn't totally work, but if you kind of imagine these as cities whose kind of societies basically collapsed, how quickly they were able to recover is just really astounding to me. So I think power was restored to at least homes that weren't completely destroyed within, I think it was like a month or so. Water pumps were restored within, I think it was just a few days. Actually, maybe what surprised me even more was some intermediate services were back within the next 2 or 3 days. So they had trains running. Yeah, trains running on like day 2. I remember learning that there was a bank where I think, God, this is awful. I think literally all of the employees were killed immediately, but the bank was able to reopen a few days later. And those services were actually just really important to getting things up and running again. Other things too, like telecommunications. So they had phones back, I think, on day 2 or 3. And all of this
kind
was...
of beggars belief. But I mean, you've checked the sources on this? It's like...
I mean, I think the thing that makes it less generalizable is obviously the fact that they just had tremendous support from very nearby cities. And those volunteers would have come in and like literally hauled, in some cases, new like pieces of equipment. And then I think population levels reached the levels from before the detonations within, I think it was a decade for both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I want to say that infrastructure reconstruction was completed in much less than that. So on the scale of a few years, but I could be remembering that wrong.
All right. So that's an amazing one that perhaps speaks more to the fact that you can maybe get infrastructure back on like surprisingly easily, or at least like localized disasters, perhaps you can rebuild much faster than you expect. I guess we had this actually. So we're just jumping all over the place here, but I hope you don't mind too much, listeners. In general, like Germany was destroyed to like such an incredible degree, like massive amounts of death, massive infrastructure destruction. Likewise with Japan, like Europe in general. Yeah. And there was a post-war boom, right?
Exactly.
Like the economies did fine. GDP recovered to previous levels and like exceeded them within decades. Population got back to like previous levels before too long, despite this being the most devastating war. Okay, so the Soviet Union suffered perhaps even worse than Japan and Germany in the end. I mean, in terms of like population loss, it was a third of the population. But the Soviet Union went on to be this massive threatening thing that like was a superpower that could take on the US within decades, like within less than decades.
Right. I mean, Germany and Japan were economic miracles. Yeah. And I think there's an interesting study that I'm sure is not perfect, but looked at Vietnamese cities that had been bombed and when you look 10 years beyond what was really the complete destruction of many cities in Vietnam, like poverty, trade, all the indicators that you'd look to were at least as good as comparator cities and as like you would have predicted if you'd just drawn a line from the trajectory those cities were on. And some cities were doing quite a bit better because when you spend money on investing in infrastructure, it actually like has some like economic benefits. And so it's really not obvious that massive physical infrastructure damage will like wipe a city off. In fact, there can be a real momentum in rebuilding that can lead cities to be even bigger.
Now, these things aren't like quite analogous to the
Sure.
to the nuclear war apocalypse case, or even the like pandemic that kills 99% of people case. But I think the thing that I kind of take away from this is that capital is cheap. Infrastructure is like surprisingly cheap. Like if you have the know-how and you have the people and you have the culture and the corporation, like the institutions, if that stuff kind of persists, you can rebuild a house real fast and you can like start rebuilding, I don't know, like manufacturing. I guess actually cars are pretty hard to manufacture. I won't say that.
Yeah.
But like maybe like electricity grids, like surprisingly easy to get back up and running.
I think that's
despite
right.
like massive damage.
And I think that's exactly what I got from it too, is not like we'd rebuild civilization in days after, you know, the worldwide collapse of everything. But it is just that physical stuff. Like we've built it very slowly over time. And so we have this image of it as having needed all of that time to be built. But I think that's just not right at all. If you imagine like a massive amount of resources just being thrown out at all at once.
Yeah.
I think you can just get really quick. Oh, a fun fact, actually, I think China builds the equivalent of a new Rome like every day. I think that's the fact. I think it's like they have so much construction.
Okay. In terms of like sheer number of buildings or something.
Something like that. I forget exactly what the metric is, but.
Wow. Oh, because Rome had like 1 million people at its peak.
Maybe it's like a week, but.
I wonder if this is something where they're like doing a GDP value of all of the infrastructure and then
Yeah,
valuing it.
I didn't dig in super hard to that fact.
Yeah. But I mean, something in that order kind of like makes sense. Another interesting kind of historical analogy that like doesn't quite fit but speaks to the fact that people don't turn on one another that much is mass aerial bombing in World War II, which has come up on the show previously, I think in the episode with Daniel Ellsberg, where he talked about there was this big theory in the military in 30s and 40s that if you bombed a city a lot, like London, like Dresden, like Tokyo, that people would lose their morale and they would like lose the will to fight the war and it would cause the other country to surrender.
Right.
Nothing could be further from the truth. It had like no effect like that. Like, do we remember the Blitz in London as the time that people like lost interest in fighting the Nazis?
Right.
We do not. And nor is that the case in any of the other countries that were bombed. Like they pulled together and they felt like extremely angry with the people who were fighting them. And in fact, like they coordinated more than ever in order to like overcome this adversity. And something that's unique about that case, I guess, is something that's different about that case is that you're specifically fighting an enemy, an external enemy.
Sure.
But we saw some of that with the pandemic and like in the war cases, which is some of the most destructive, then you would have this thing. You could imagine in the post-nuclear apocalypse thing that people would feel like an enormous sense of camaraderie with their fellow citizens who have suffered this immense
we are all
catastrophe.
Suffering because of the same thing, whether it's a nameable entity or like another state or a pandemic. And the other thing I have about this is even if you get some groups where for whatever random reason there happens to be more violent people or something, and you actually do get some like set of factors that means there's violence, they're just, I guess this only applies if you have isolated groups, at least somewhat isolated groups. But like, it doesn't really make sense to think of it as a single, I don't know, pool of survivors. If it's many survivors, there'll be kind of geographic variation in like what culture is like, just like there is now. If there are a few survivors, they'll probably be in like groups that actually don't contact each other that much because they're like, one's trapped on Australia. I mean, maybe not trapped, but they've settled in different places and they're not really exchanging much. And then like, you have to think it's a really dominant outcome is that none of these groups will end up being cooperative. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, you could have that view. It's a really dark view. You have to believe that human nature is just really, but it just does not seem strategically robust.
Other data points.
Go on.
At some point we have to flip this around and try to steel man the position.
Totally, you're right.
But so even historically, when you have like a very aggressive group that tries to attack another one, they don't almost ever try to like exterminate the group that they're conquering. They want to tax them almost always. And so it's like, even if you're a marauding group, in the like post-nuclear war world, what you want to do is get people into your control so they farm, and then you like tax some of the agricultural like surplus that they're producing, ideally.
Yeah.
The scenario where descent into conflict and just total strife and lack of coordination potentially makes sense is one in which there are no productive opportunities, where there's no ability to farm or make food or really do anything.
Right. But then you're dead anyways.
Yeah. So then, probably you're somewhat dead. I guess you could have this thing where it's like that was true for like a particular amount of time, and if only you'd managed to coordinate better, then you could have made it through to the so in the nuclear winter case, like if you're in a place where it's just like it's impossible to collect or produce any food, then it looks more like the war scenario where you have a siege on a city where there's a fixed amount of food and no one can really do anything about the siege, or the great majority of people can't, and there you do get people turning on one another towards the end when they're at the point of starvation, typically. But I think that is an inaccurate model of what the war. So certainly in the case where the infrastructure isn't destroyed and you don't have like massive, like a sufficient climate disturbance that agriculture becomes impossible. In fact, people will see like productive opportunities all around them to scavenge things, to try to grow things, to like to move to a place where you can grow things, to like even in places where it's incredibly cold and you can't grow wheat or whatever, you can still do fishing.
Grow potatoes.
Right? Grow potatoes.
Or if not fishing.
Okay. So I think that might be like where the folk sense of we would just descend into Mad Max comes from, is the idea that there's nothing that you can make. But I think that is empirically unlikely.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. Is there any other evidence that we can point to in favor of the pro-conflict view?
I mean, I will always probably bottom out on like, at some point there's an equilibrium where like the number of people left match the number of, or the resources left. And unless it's at like 4 people left, those people will stop killing each other because they'll have enough food and water. And then
now they've got to learn to get along.
So I like usually end up there, even if I can get to some reason to think that there'd be lots of fighting. There are some studies, actually, that I looked into ages ago during my trial with 80K that suggest there's some link between climate variation and war. So I think in particular, a lot of the studies seem to show that drought leads to more conflict, at least at the... my memory is that it is the case that it increases civil war, but it's not clear if it's the case that it increases interstate war. But I guess even increasing civil war would be like that's some consistent evidence. With the so you can't engage in agriculture as much, or there's not enough food, and so people start. I think the theory was basically that the opportunity cost of war is lower because you can't use people as productively to grow food. So like to take up arms, you might get something beneficial like some other resource by taking it with your winnings, but you don't have much opportunity to like grow things yourself because the climate's too inhospitable. And I guess that's just kind of the scenario you're describing, or you did a few minutes ago, that was like, if resources are so limited that there's nothing to be gained. The alternative is starvation. There's no benefit from cooperation. Or at least it's like vastly reduced. My like internal model of the food scarcity, like in a normal society where like everyone is still surviving, is that people just become very dissatisfied with the social order, and so they're more inclined to say, "Oh, the government is failing us," and so they're like more inclined to revolt in order to like try to change the government. But if they don't have a good understanding of why there's not enough food, then they could just end up overthrowing the government and like disagreeing about what the new structure should be. And then fighting and like it's not useful. So this is a case where it's like, if you think that your food is very expensive because the government is failing, then it's rational to do what you're doing. But if that's a mistaken model, then you've caused conflict without like a personal benefit. And there you need to believe something like the survivors' models of the government and food production are wrong. And that seems possible. Doesn't seem crazy that people would misjudge whether a coup would be helpful.
Yeah, I guess the conflict thing seems actually more probable in a scenario where there's more people surviving, potentially.
Right. And then I, again, get to a place where I'm like, once you get to fewer people, it stops making as much sense. So it does equilibrate or something before zero or like anything close. But yeah, I think that's right.
One thing we haven't talked about yet that might be in people's minds is how many people would die of radiation and fallout and all that stuff after a nuclear war? Like how inhospitable, how uninhabitable is the land afterwards?
Right. Yeah. So one thing is that, again, some geographies would be probably just completely free of radiation. So countries not involved in a nuclear war, of which probably the whole of the southern hemisphere wouldn't be, at least given current geopolitics. Maybe in like 300 years, the whole world has nuclear weapons, and then there's radiation everywhere. But if you take now as your starting point, plenty of places won't have any radiation at all. And lots will have some radiation, but not radiation that makes it impossible to survive. So you might get higher rates of cancer, you might get higher rates of miscarriages. But even in plenty of places in North America or some places in East Asia or like Europe would probably be pretty terrible. But some places you'd have lower fertility rates, but still clearly be able to build a population. And just like you'd survive.
I see. So it's bad for health, but not. I guess, so you're suggesting it's like it's somewhat localized to where the bomb goes off, and it also disappears after a couple of years, or like it declines quite quickly.
It does decline very quickly. And here I found it really useful to look up like exact radiuses of actual deadly radiation levels and areas. Like the area around a nuclear bomb that is actually deadly was just a bit smaller than I thought. And then I do think, and this, again, I should actually just do a bunch of jogging my memory about this. But I think that radioactivity declines super quickly, and that even areas that are initially, I mean, Chernobyl, you can walk through.
Right.
So it's like decades. There is something else, which is, so there's some reason to think that radiation would be localized just because of the constraints of where the war is and who the targets are. But Louis Dartnell, who I was chatting to about this, suggested that maybe nuclear power plants all over would melt down as their like safeguards basically failed. Yeah.
What happens with the...
So there are safeguards that would mean that even if all of the power went away, the thing would shut off safely as soon as it detected a power failure. And so you wouldn't get like, I think when he first brought this up, I was like, oh my gosh, they'd all melt down as soon as the power grid went down.
They're designed not to do that, ideally.
They are, But eventually there's a bunch of coolant that gets released into the core of a reactor that is basically the safe mechanism, if I remember correctly. And that's housed in concrete, basically. And at some point, concrete can deteriorate. And so if we're talking about long enough timescales, you would have kind of random meltdowns that would happen just as the infrastructure breaks down, unless people didn't find some way to either bring them back online and keep them safe. And that would basically just happen kind of randomly. Some of them are really big and would have really significant...
So nuclear power plants work by having lots of material that's releasing neutrons close to other material that's releasing neutrons, and the neutrons prompt more release of neutrons from neighboring material. But it seems like you should be able to stop them from operating as nuclear power plants by moving the stuff apart, by separating the blocks of, I think they have like uranium concrete mix or something. I'm not a nuclear engineer, but it seems like ideally we should have some system for them dispersing the material if they're just...
in like a stable way.
If just nobody comes to work. I don't know. But I guess we didn't set them up this way, potentially. My memory is that, and again, I think actually Louis Dartnell, who I was chatting about this with, is also not a nuclear physicist. But he seemed to really think that at least some of the designs could eventually to just like time. Okay, maybe that's a task for someone to like go around and like play with the buttons and figure out how to like turn them off.
Exactly. That'd be great. I did, even when looking into that, like there aren't enough nuclear power plants to like have this be a major worry, but some people would have a nuclear power plant maybe randomly melt down near them, and that would be bad.
Add insult to injury, really.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're almost going through, I guess, the major underlying considerations or things that people have to get online or like get access to in order to not die. And maybe keen to like just think about a couple more like historical analogies and see like if we can learn anything from them. I guess none of them are going to be quite the same, but maybe there's something. I guess the worst pandemics that have ever been, I think there's the Black Death that killed about half of Europe. There's the Great America's pandemic that resulted from like Europeans bringing many diseases all simultaneously into populations that were there that didn't have immunity, which I think we were saying killed up to like 90% of people, possibly, or in some areas.
In some areas.
Is there anything that we can learn from that? I guess at least about the pandemic case.
Yeah, I mean, the Black Death is really interesting because it's really unclear what the effects of the Black Death were on all the metrics we care about, like poverty and life expectation. When you zoom far out enough, there are even some hypotheses that the Black Death was kind of a precursor to the Industrial Revolution, where the argument is that you had so many people die that there was a shift in basically capital became cheaper relative to labor. And so you paid people higher wages to use the capital super well. And so you had these incentives to make capital more productive. And you did that with machines, I think, is how that story goes.
Yeah.
Something like that. And who knows if that's right.
If it prompted the Industrial Revolution, it doesn't seem like or like if it arguably did, then it doesn't seem like its immediate term effects could have been that negative on society as a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like when you zoom out long enough, certainly Europe did reasonably well within a few hundred years of 50% of the population dying.
Yeah.
So whether there's something causal...
Was there like societal... Was there anything on this conflict versus people get along thing? I haven't heard of people fighting during the Black Death, but...
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of anything like fighting. I've even heard the Black Death improved social conditions for the very poor because, again, maybe related to this hypothesis that maybe we put some stock in but don't know for sure if it's right. Labor became in such short supply that the very poorest got to demand higher wages and they got to demand more rights. So there were really weird laws that said that the poor weren't allowed to wear certain types of fabric.
Sumptuary laws.
Yeah, sumptuary laws. Yeah. So these supposedly went away because poor people were empowered by the fact that they could demand more things because they were more valuable.
Yeah. I'll wear purple if I want to. God damn it.
Yeah. Apparently.
Okay, interesting. So I guess in the Black Death case, people's incomes went up because the amount of land per person roughly doubled, basically. I guess we've kind of already said this, but in the cases where like much larger fractions of people die, even in nuclear winter, like one thing that you might underestimate is that, say, 90% of people are dead. Then now each person can farm, in principle, 10 times as much land, and they can also just use the most fertile land, or like the amount of you can just divide the very best spots among the remaining people. I guess also presently, like in a country like the UK, only a few % of people work actively on farming, whereas in this new world, basically 100% of people in principle could go to like subsistence agriculture.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of flexibility to like go from where we are. I guess there's also barriers, like none of us know how to do it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, 25% of the population is subsistence farming.
Across the world,
Across the world.
So in those places, they might do a whole lot better.
Yeah, exactly. At least in the initial, I basically, more people alive today can do subsistence farming than I think in the late 1800s.
I see.
So we have at least the potential for lots of people surviving that way. I think the limitation actually there is still arable land where so I think that there's a study where someone tried to work out what the carrying capacity of the earth is for subsistence farming, where you don't use basically any kind of industrial equipment. And it was in the hundreds of millions, though they're like big error bars.
Is that using like modern plants? Because obviously they're massively, like the apples we have now and the wheat we have now is so different than what people had even centuries ago.
Yeah, I think it is using modern plants. And I think the framing of the study was like, I think it was actually throwing a bit of shade at the movement of like...
Go back to the land.
Yeah, exactly.
Saying like, well, sure, we could do that, but I guess most of us would have to cease to be.
Only 100 million of us could do it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so in that kind of scenario, we're still imagining like the great majority of people dying, but it doesn't go anywhere near zero.
Right.
Okay, a different train of thought is there anything that we can learn here from the falls of civilizations in the past, like the Roman Empire, you've got like the Khmer Empire, other great like disintegrations of coordinations across societies?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that stuck out to me about the fall of the Roman Empire is we think of it as one of the greatest disintegrations of society, and yet there were still large other groups, not only in the Eastern Roman Empire and like in the geography of the Roman Empire, but just not Romans, that not only existed but thrived in the aftermath of the fall. There are also civilizations in other areas of the world that continue to thrive. And I guess the disanalogy there is like right now, the world systems are much more interconnected. But at some point, there again seems to be this kind of trade-off where if you've got lots of people surviving and you have this very interconnected web of critical systems, lots of them will collapse because they're kind of interreliant on each other. But at some point, we'll have regressed to the point where we're more isolated groups. And at that point, we actually just do look more like pre-industrial societies with like more minimal contact, more minimal interconnected systemness. Like maybe we go back to having some trade, but it's like not systems that will break each other's if they themselves are broken. And so it actually stops looking quite so disanalogous. It's like complexity does break, but there's a cap on that when you start getting groups that have more rudimentary technologies again. And yeah, so I think it's something like when you get to these smaller groups, they become much more decoupled and decorrelated. And then even if terrible things happen to some of them, like there is a natural catastrophe, like a earthquake that might seriously harm one, or like a blight that might, like some of these groups will just get unlucky. But it will no longer be the scenario where a thing that affects one population will like trickle through to all populations. They'll be much more decorrelated, which in a way will make at least civilization as a whole, or human society, more robust in kind of a similar way to pre-industrial societies.
Yeah, interesting. Because it does feel reasonably different, especially so the fall of the Western Roman Empire was quite a gradual process in a way, where they kept like moving
That's
the
true.
capital, and they just became poorer
Right.
and like less organized, and the army wasn't what it used to be.
Right. Yeah,
suppose,
it's almost
like,
a misnomer.
Yeah. I think like the population did decline.
It did.
Because agriculture, I think, was less productive because they weren't as organized. And like, they probably lost some of the technical skill that they previously had.
Yeah. But I think it was more of a mix of, I think I've like had it in my head that everyone died.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
It's like, well, who's killing the last one?
Right.
It's always this thing that keeps coming back up. Yeah.
But like, that's not quite what happened. And also sometimes people just moved away from city. Like it was like the city of Rome declined, but it was...
I think the city of Rome had actually already become not a very important city by the time the like supposed fall of the Roman Empire.
That's totally true.
I suppose, what can we learn about it? One thing is just how much they managed to accomplish at that time with technology that we think of as pretty rudimentary.
Right.
Like, they didn't really have like that much paper, couldn't travel quickly. It's like most people are illiterate. And they managed to coordinate in order to accomplish stuff that's really remarkable. In some ways, it's like, I wish that our government sometimes worked as well as the Roman government did.
Right.
In terms of just, ease of dealing with it.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a glib joke, but it is impressive how much you can accomplish on a practical level with engineering that is far worse than what we have now.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you get decreasing returns to complexity. And so losing some complexity, if we don't lose all the complexity, doesn't lose us proportionately as much of the productivity or something.
Yeah.
That does seem important.
Maybe another example of this stuff that people managed to do in the past, like a lot of the technology that we have now that blows my mind, is that we managed to like get to basically all the Pacific islands. Like, people were, I don't know, as I understand it, the group that originally went and colonized a lot of the Pacific islands originated in Taiwan, and they just kept kind of island hopping. But what is going through these people's minds? Because they've reached some island where they're presumably doing all right, and they've got a bunch of people, and they're like, let's build a boat and like sail out east and see what's there.
You don't know what's there.
It's like, I guess I don't know how much people have tried to look into this and exactly what the motivation was. Maybe they were struggling for food at the time, or they had overcrowding, or perhaps they were just such good sailors that they could tell there was islands there for one reason or another. Like,
or
people talk about birds,
get back if they needed to.
Yeah, or they knew how to get back. But just incredible, the level of human ingenuity. I suppose I feel like people alive today probably don't have quite that level of grit, but maybe even so, that will be more numerous in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, is there anything else we can learn from the ancients?
Yeah, I guess one kind of interesting thing. So Rome had these amazing achievements, and lots of them left physical artifacts, and like not all of them were recreated by people living in the same region or other regions for a very long time afterward. When you might have thought that just by seeing the things around, someone would have been inspired to try to recreate it, or at least try to like understand the technology and see if they wanted that technology for something else.
Yeah, what's an example of that?
One example is concrete. So concrete is amazing and one of the most useful things for construction that we have and is everywhere and all the time. And the Romans had Roman concrete that's pretty similar to the concrete we have today. And they used it to build these amazing architectural feats. And those structures obviously stay standing. And so we like had this idea that that they were possible. It was there. We could like take pieces of it and look at
what's
it.
In this?
Yeah. So we could, try to work it out, and just no one bothered. So I think the first modern use of concrete wasn't until like 1800. So yeah, just many centuries later.
So in the meantime, was there some rubbish concrete that people were using?
I don't know for sure. It seems like probably there was a substitute that was good enough, because we like built some pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
But Portland concrete is like
forward.
Amazing, I think, relative to more rudimentary forms of concrete. And given that we had figured it out and used it extensively, and then it had like major kind of benefits over the next best thing.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty surprising that no one tried, or at least no one succeeded.
Yeah. Any other examples?
Yeah. I mean, it did. That kind of opened this thread of like, how does knowledge like that persist over time? Like, does it degrade? Does it get taught? When it gets taught, do we like lose some important bits? And so some examples of knowledge degrading over time that were kind of interesting. I think one was, Polynesian islanders lost the ability to build boats and then got stuck.
That's a big problem.
Yes. Yeah. So that one is, I think, like when apparently maybe there's some evidence that when you get really small populations and you try to pass down skills between generations, in a way you're like making copies of information. And when you like try to teach it, if the number of people learning it is small enough, the copies will get lower and lower fidelity. People will like...
Because there's not enough people to cross-reference and correct mistakes, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And another one is the more people you have, the more people innovate. And then you get like improvements that make up for losses in like the basic skill. But yeah, I think the way you can think of it is if someone's teaching you to shoot an arrow, lots of people will be worse at it than the master. And you need enough people learning it to have
in the next
some
generation,
people
there's someone as
exceed.
good as the best person in the previous time. Otherwise, it just gets gradually worse. Or the state of the art gets gradually worse.
Yeah. And so apparently this is the way in which at least one group of Tasmanians lost the ability to build fire. Though in that case, it seemed less stakesy because they were able to like go get fire from their neighbors. But they like had to like go light fires and then bring them back to their...
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose I've heard of the Tasmanian cases. I think actually the sea rose and then they were disconnected from the rest of the mainland. And I think so the population now, you've got like a pocket there that has like a much smaller population in aggregate than you previously thought.
Yeah.
And you don't cease exchanging information as much with the rest of Australia. And then the technology like degraded basically through this population's too low mechanism that you can no longer sustain what you had before.
And that's fire?
I think fire among other things. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Other things. I hadn't heard of other things.
All right. I guess we've just finished laying out the cards here. I suppose we're a couple of hours into this. But it's like a lot of the considerations we've kind of canvassed and figured out like what are the main worries and what are some ameliorating factors. Let's try to bring it together now a little bit and think about the direct extinction case. So there's two different paths to collapse leading to extinction that you consider kind of separately. One is 99.99% of people die, and then relatively quickly the rest of them also die. So it'd be like, I guess you call that direct extinction? Oh,
yeah.
And then there's another path, which is we get a collapse of industrial civilization. We go back to some agricultural, I guess conceivably even pre-agricultural level of technological development. And we stay there for a long time such that then something like 100 years, 1,000 years later, before we manage to recover, let alone get off of Earth, something else like, I don't know, a comet, a super volcano, something else manages to drive us to extinction. So let's do the first one first. What is a story that people tell, if they tell any story, for how even, say, 99.99% of people dying in some kind of cataclysm? So we got 800,000 or so people left. How then all of them would end up dying as well?
Yeah, I think probably the stories people tell most often are like, it's a nuclear winter. There's a 10-year period where a lot of the world is really inhospitable to agriculture. And it takes a lot of ingenuity to come up with alternative foods. Like in some places, if you can't grow traditional crops, maybe growing mushrooms or something. And I know you've talked about that before on the show. And so those things feel like possible, but hard. And so if there are few enough people And like fewer people means less creativity and resourcefulness, I think.
Not many mushroom farmers left.
Exactly. Yeah. You're less likely to like happen to have gotten someone who knows all about algae and fishing.
Okay.
Then they just aren't able to figure out how to feed themselves in the like time period. And there's not much of a buffer because a bunch of crops froze. And it's so cold in some places that you
People
can't.
die of cold.
Yeah, you die of cold. You like can't.
Not easy to migrate.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, why is that wrong?
Yeah, I think that's wrong in part because of this non-uniform distribution of effects thing. So people in some places will have basically that experience, and then people in other places will be able to fish and they won't have to migrate. And unless you got some disaster that by some weird coincidence happened to kill everyone in the areas that would be more hospitable to agriculture, even though that's not where any of the nuclear war was. You'd have to just get exceedingly unlucky for all of the negative effects to like be in the right places. And it's hard to think of a story where they're concentrated that way.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems like it fails on like multiple different levels. One is it seems like a misunderstanding of the nuclear winter scenario where it doesn't last that long or is quite as bad as that, and it's not global in that to that extent. It like varies a lot.
I think that's the first. Yeah, I think that's the first way it fails. There are other ways it probably could fail, but I'd have less
misunderstanding,
confidence.
I guess, of like different ways that people can feed ourselves and like how many different sources of calories there might be, especially if the number of survivors is small. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so even like lots of organic material, even frozen, will still be consumable.
Yeah.
So that's like one. I mean, there are just all sorts of ways you could feed yourself, at least in like relatively small numbers. I think when people point at holes in alternative foods, it's more because it's like hard to scale, which is true. And so if you're trying to feed lots of people, it could be really, really, really challenging. And maybe lots of people would die. But it's hard to get to the extinction level.
How much uncertainty is there about like how bad a nuclear winter would be? Like, is there some right tale of like we've totally misunderstood and maybe it's just going to be way colder than we imagine?
Yeah, that's not my understanding. And my guess, if there were any kind of directional bias in the nuclear winter research, is like the research that's been done, again, is talking about a nuclear war that's much worse than one that we'd see today.
Because it was done in the 80s when the stockpiles were so much larger.
Exactly, yeah. And the nuclear bombs themselves were many times bigger than the ones that are in our stockpiles now. And then on top of that, I think the research that we have came out of a time when it was especially beneficial to have lots of research that suggested that nuclear bombs were terrible. And so, like, while I think the nuclear winter hypothesis could totally be right and hold up, if there's like any bias at all, I would guess it'd be in the direction of overstating how bad it would be. And like, if that was true, it'd be like implicit bias, and I would expect none of it was intentional. But it wouldn't be shocking if like some of the research that came out of that era were.
I think like people could understandably think, well, it's better to like err on the side of saying that this could be really bad rather than like giving people false sense of security about it, given that there's lots of uncertainty, because it seems like it's worse to
Right. Yeah. That definitely seems true.
And I guess just as it behooves us to assume the worst and try really hard to avoid it.
Yeah, right. It may have even been like really good for the world.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's anything about the models that makes me think it could be much colder. I guess there's just one reason it's really hard to model nuclear winter is that like some parameters in climate models are apparently just insanely hard to get right. Apparently clouds are really hard to model.
They're the big X factor.
Yeah. Exactly. And so to the extent that the model could be wrong in the direction of clouds would make it much colder. Or like, for example,
I mean, I think one way that doesn't get you to extinction is like you just still have the food from the sea thing, which I think is just so hard to prevent that from being accessible in some places, somewhere.
Right.
Because the sea's not going to freeze, and like certainly not in the tropics. And surprisingly, I think like plankton can still do photosynthesis in like quite low light.
Yeah,
and
I
then
think photosynthesis is the hardest thing, but even that.
So we can still have our like fish and mussel diet and seaweed and Okay. Is there another story? I guess there's the thing that we kind of alluded to, is the people imagining that people just kill one another until there's almost none of them left.
Yeah.
Is there anything to be said for that?
Yeah, I guess maybe, let's see. One thing that I've heard is people saying that it's not that you're killing every last person in conflict, but it's that you are like, you're like wasting the grace period and all of these other kind of advantages that you have, like food lying around. If everyone's really violent because they're hoarding these resources, but they accidentally just eat through a bunch of it because they're wasting time fighting each other instead of cooperating. Like they could just misjudge their own trade-offs.
Or they could become too short-term focused because they're just thinking about surviving against other hostile forces.
Right. Like rationally, they'd like stop fighting at some point because food's getting low and they should focus on finding more food. But if they're not able to accurately predict or calculate how much food they need and how long it will last and how easy it will be to like grow new food, maybe they just incorrectly keep fighting and it's not a benefit.
Yeah, wasting time that they could have been using to like reestablish agriculture.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like it kind of requires this misjudgment. If people are so good at coordinating to fight one another, why don't they like set down roots and then start creating food and then like defend themselves?
It is hard for me to imagine any reason that they don't. But I do think that's a story I've heard.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose you have to say something like people are all at one another's throats in like small groups. So groups that are small enough to create trouble and fight one another, but not big enough that they think that they can make food or find a reliable source of food. And they just keep fighting. And I guess at some point enough people die or they get hungry enough that they now wish they'd been investing in getting food. Oh, they've run out of stocks or something.
Yeah.
But now it's too late. They don't have time to like reorient themselves towards like fishing.
Right.
And so they die before they come to their senses.
Right. Maybe it just takes a really long time to learn to fish, plant the crops, and learn how to have planted the crops in the first place. And so by the time they realize they're really hungry, it's actually just a year away from having a lot of food.
Yeah. Is there any other criticisms to make with that other than that it's like a series of things that each individually seem either unlikely or foolish happening one after another?
I mean, it just doesn't seem like we see that. I can't think of any, I feel like I can think of examples where conflict peters out because basic needs aren't being met and people transition to meeting basic needs.
But not the reverse.
I think like wars in Europe subsided, at least to some extent, during the Black Death. I guess that wasn't... Yeah, it just seems like people aren't often making this huge mistake. But maybe the big difference here is no one's ever had to learn agriculture from scratch in this way. And so they actually just don't have the requisite knowledge to judge how long it will take to learn.
Yeah. I suppose another criticism we have raised is that this has to happen everywhere. So not just in the North Island of New Zealand, but also the South Island of New Zealand and also Tasmania. So there has to be some very strong attractor towards this kind of behavior, which would just be so peculiar given that we basically can't think of historical examples where this seems to have happened.
Yeah, exactly. If it was going to happen, you'd really think it would have happened. We've had lots of resource scarcity throughout history, and here we are. Yeah, exactly. And again, it goes back to this idea that if groups get small and isolated enough, they start getting really decoupled. And so maybe this happens in some places, but to think that every group will have this happen is weird.
I guess once the population gets low enough, now just like fighting other people, it's a massive commute. Who wants to be traveling so far? I mean, I think it's like actually does become potentially an issue once we're talking about like really small groups.
Right.
So how low does it have to get before you hit some like death spiral where the genetic, there isn't enough genetic diversity?
I mean, I think it's the Ashkenazi Jews who do have higher rates of many diseases, but clearly are fine and probably could repopulate the earth with a viable population. I think their ancestors were numbered in the 300. I think 300 is the number.
300.
I think it's 300.
So people look at the level of genetic diversity there and they try to back out, well, what was the bottleneck that it must have gone through? Yeah. And I guess it wasn't just one moment in time. It's more of there's 300 ancestors who produced basically all of it, all of the genetic material. Okay.
Yeah, which maybe is different. But.
And basically that's led to a bunch of, I guess, recessive genetic things, whereas you have two faulty genes, and that's more common when you have very little diversity.
Exactly.
But nonetheless,
exactly.
It doesn't seem to have been a decisive impediment.
Right. I mean, incest happens, and people have kids all the time that are very close relatives. And that's because you have to get kind of unlucky to get an actual thing that prevents reproduction or that causes the child to die.
Well, I guess cousin marriage is quite common in some places now, and especially historically, and people cite that as a cause of potential social problems or health problems. But again, it's like definitely not decisive by any means.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of like two animals like producing offspring that then like reproduce in other species?
I think the smallest number that successfully repopulated was a group of 40 tigers, and they actually needed a lot of help from humans. But still, that seems, I don't know, helpful.
Wow. Okay. Anyway, the numbers are like low.
The numbers are low. They seem to be in the hundreds for like some confidence.
Yeah. And I suppose this is a problem that potentially gets worse over time, I think, because it's like obviously the first generation too isn't enough to produce the next generation. We know that from like individual families. Right. The issue is then like going again and again through this cycle where I think you actually like lose material potentially because you get like more copying over and you even like lose the genetic material of two over time. But over these many generations, potentially you're reuniting with people in other parts of the world. So potentially you just need like 300, it sounds like, globally, even if they can eventually all reconnect, like within a period of generations.
Yeah, generations. I do think 300 globally isn't crazy.
Isn't crazy. Okay. So it really does have to get, like 800,000 is more than enough.
Definitely. You're not hitting on genetic bottlenecks at all there.
Okay. What about something you have the nuclear window, you get down to 800,000, like some other similar catastrophe? Do you basically need some other like very improbable, very severe catastrophe after that in order, like that comes in quick succession?
Yeah. So for the direct extinction, it still felt really hard to me to tell this story. So like, let's say that you have 800,000 people. Let's say that you have 80,000 people. They're probably not in one place, especially if you had these non-uniform effects. Like if you only have 80,000 people left, they're probably randomly all over the world, and they're probably not going to end up in one place that quickly. And so then things like earthquakes, they just won't affect the different groups. So it's hard to have a thing that affects all of them. Climate effects plausibly get closer to affecting all of them. But even climate effects just don't affect the whole world equally, basically, ever.
Yeah.
So it'd have to be like, for some reason, maybe they were all in one region of the world, which isn't crazy. Maybe they'd all be in Australia, New Zealand.
Hold on, everyone in South America died?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Everyone in Africa died?
I know. You don't even have like 2,000 people in South America. It does seem...
How incompetent are you saying these people are? Yeah.
You're right.
Well, yeah. But it is very interesting when you like try getting really concrete like that.
Exactly.
Like, why didn't they move to like the place in South America that's most maybe they found it hard to migrate. It's so like people are everywhere. Yeah.
And you wouldn't... Yeah, 80,000 people... On the one hand, if you think about it abstractly, 80,000 people is like a small city. It's easy to imagine a small city getting wiped out, but that's just not what it looks like. It looks like groups of 5,000 in a bunch of different places. They all just are like facing like very different environmental and climatic and all sorts of conditions.
Yeah, I suppose so you get down to 80,000 people, then you have like a massive supervolcano that compounds the climate problem, or you have like a serious asteroid impact. But it does start to feel like now just the prior on that happening is at that most inauspicious moment is so low that we don't have to like super worry about that scenario playing out in the first place.
Right. So that's actually the main reason I distinguish between direct extinction and this longer non-recovery, because the longer non-recovery scenario is actually, the way I'm thinking of it, is actually just like, if you give it long enough, you will have a supervolcano erupt, and then that could kill everyone. But basically, something completely unconnected from the first catastrophe happening that would kill the 80,000 survivors scattered all over the planet is exceedingly improbable. And the only way that happens, in all likelihood, or in like the vast majority of likelihood, is that it takes longer. I'm basically thinking of like, if you don't go extinct, maybe you don't recover immediately. And so you have to, maybe you like delay the time of perils, this like period where all sorts of things like asteroids and volcanoes could cause extinction. Maybe those happen. But for those to be likely enough to happen that we actually worry about them, you need a much longer time scale than like the 10 years after the first catastrophe.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn now to the indirect possible route to extinction, which is that civilization collapses, we don't have industry anymore, maybe we don't even have proper agriculture, and we get like stuck in some like not very impressive state for such a long time that something like an asteroid, supervolcano, whatever, does us in. I guess there's no definitive answers. There's no like particular timeline where it's like, well, we have to do it by like this specific date, otherwise we'll be done in. It's more just like this risk that gets worse and worse the longer we happen to take. Right. And I guess we don't know what that risk is because nature never actually did drive us to extinction. Yeah. But it seems like the annual rate, as we've talked about on, say, the episode with Toby Ord and I think some other times on the show, the natural rate of extinction for humanity as like a hunter-gatherer species has to be pretty low. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have been around in one form or another for like 100,000 to a million years. So it seems like there's a pretty good chance that even if it took us 10,000 years, we would probably still be fine because we lasted much longer than 10,000 years. Yeah. I guess we've had agriculture for 14,000 years. I think like a million years ago, there was something that was similar to Homo sapiens, but it was like somewhat different. I guess there's just this like ambiguity about like at what point did we become the same species? Yeah. But anyway, I guess in broad strokes, it seems like we could say if we could get back to where we are now or like get off the planet or something in 2,000 years, then the odds of us having been wiped out in the meantime by some other cause is pretty low. Like we're talking maybe like a single percentage points. Yeah, exactly. My best guess at a range of how long it might take based on how long it took us to get to agriculture in the first place from like early humans just doing hunting and gathering. And then again, to get from agriculture to industrialization, that takes maybe tens of thousands of years. But considering that you will already have the knowledge that these things are possible, or at least some like vague passed down memories that these things are possible. And you have things just lying around, like some things will decay beyond recognition, but things like some agricultural technologies, including just a shovel, will take a very long time to degrade. Some materials last a long time. And people will find them and experiment with them in all likelihood. And then that will speed up, I think, especially progress toward industrial-ish level agriculture. Beyond that, yeah, I think you get to something like maybe it would take a couple of thousands of years at the longest. And then you just clearly have plenty of time. And so the only thing I worry about here is if it happens to be the case that humanity has a really hard time getting beyond current levels of technology, and we're not able to drive any of these risks low enough that they don't happen in a kind of recurring way, where we basically get into a cycle of collapse and then recovery, but then we don't solve things and we collapse again because we have another war with a different kind of bomb this time. I see. And then this goes on and we just burn down the clock. And at some point, we'll stop having enough time before we get we get unlucky, or we just have run down the clock so far. It was about time that some natural catastrophe will do us in. But that has to happen a bunch of times before we get to that probability clock becomes high. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's maybe come back to the cyclical thing in a minute, and instead just like canvas considerations in favor of like rapid recovery versus very slow recovery. Sure. Yeah, how much of a benefit do you think we would get from having these artifacts and libraries and possibly cultural memory as well, depending on how much is passed down? I'm guessing that there's historical analogies here where knowledge has been forgotten and we can see how quickly did people redevelop it. Yeah. So I mentioned the example of Roman concrete, which is centuries of a lost technology. So there's a case where people can see a thing and not necessarily be inspired to make it or use it or figure out how it worked. Yeah, there are, I guess, mostly lots of examples of people finding technologies or being given technologies but not shown how they work and like pretty quickly figuring it out and innovating on them. So that's like guns during some periods of history. And I think the only example I could find where like there was a technology that one group wanted, that they had evidence existed and had some sense of how it worked, but they couldn't reproduce, was the Cold War era missile designs. So it seems like it's for the most technical. Yeah, exactly. Super technical. So I think it was like spies found the blueprints for a particular, I forget exactly what the technology was, but then their country wasn't able to recreate it. But for the most part, it seems like with examples and the motivation, which maybe the motivation is the questionable bit. So it's the lack of factor. Did you learn anything interesting about, how long books and libraries and information would last, or how long these artifacts would take before they, I would think like rust might become an issue, or like cars, like even the shovels you're saying would last a long time, but some of them, at least if they weren't kept properly, eventually they would become a bit hard to reverse engineer.
Yep, that's true. So I did just Google around for how long different materials take to degrade.
How long for car2rust.com.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it was basically that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, so it's like wood can last for years or decades, depending on how it's treated. Metal can last longer, also depends on the metals and how it's treated. But still, that's maybe decades. And I think there are like different levels of degradation. So there's like, is it usable? And then there's also like, is it recognizable? And both of those are useful, though one more than the other. But then some things are just really long lasting. So concrete lasts probably many decades or hundreds of years. In some cases,
thousands.
Many hundreds of years. And steel lasts a really long time. And then, those kind of physical materials.
Plastic famously lasts a long time.
Plastic lasts such a long time. Annoyingly, you can't really... Well, actually, you can melt a lot of plastics down and just remold them.
Oh, really?
Depends on the kind. And Louis Startnell, in his book, actually, you can just look up which kind of like number of plastics you can actually reuse. So if you're ever in the post-apocalyptic world and need plastic, you can read his book. If it lasts. So you also asked about libraries and books and how long they might last. And basically, it's again kind of related to variability across geographies. So in some geographies where it's very wet and there's lots of humidity, books would probably disintegrate super, super quickly within, years.
Really? So in like tropical areas, libraries, books that only last years? I would think decades.
Maybe.
I suppose maybe they do a whole lot to dehumidify the air and things like that in order to like prevent books from getting too wet and like degrading.
Yeah. I think there are things like they'll also just get so moldy and just have things growing on them that they'd be only like partially legible or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember reading, so people who study ancient Indian history have a real hell of a time of it because they basically only have stone artifacts and metals and things like that because all of the like written records disappeared because it is quite a human place and things would rot. Some works of literature were passed down, but they had to be copied very frequently, which means that they actually were like more errors were introduced more quickly. And there was more frequently the author would be like, I don't like this. I'm going to change this. So they like evolved more quickly in the intervening time.
Right.
So it's a little bit hard to know whether they're the same as they were 2,000 or 3,000 years ago.
That's so interesting.
Of course, this is also true in Europe to some degree. Like I think a lot of the Roman stuff, an astonishing amount of the Roman records that we have are actually only preserved because they were stored in parts of the desert in Egypt that are extremely dry. And like a lot of the stuff that would have been in Italy wouldn't have made it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which goes right to the next point, which is that some areas have really great climates for storing paper and there'd be super arid climates where books could last. Yeah, I think it's centuries, but I would want to double check.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think it's bonkers with the papyrus stuff in Egypt because
that's true.
Like in southern Egypt,
that is a great example.
They're like just like digging up and being like, oh, here's like a receipt for like someone's coffee back like 2,500 years ago. And it's basically fine. Or it's like totally readable. That's a very unusual, I guess, climate. It's like completely dry. Yeah.
Right. And I think my memory is that modern books would do a bit worse than that.
I see.
But
papyrus
still,
is like better material.
Yeah, exactly. But that still lots of modern books would last hundreds of years in some climates. Yeah. And then, I guess I did a little back of the envelope calculation to try to estimate, would we have to get really lucky for libraries to survive or like stores of information like libraries to survive? And I think I felt kind of fine about that, or I didn't feel like that was going to be show-stopping. Even if you get lots of infrastructure damage, that's going to be non-uniform. It's going to be where nuclear bombs are dropped. And so then you have all of the libraries in the Southern Hemisphere, or like a third of them. And then some of the climates in the Southern Hemisphere will be hospitable enough. And it does get whittled down to like fewer libraries than you'd like. But there are like clearly dozens, hundreds or more surviving.
I think you cite the number of libraries in the world. It's like quite large. It's like in the hundreds of thousands, I think.
Yeah, I think it's 120,000.
Yeah, okay. And they're spread around, obviously, basically everywhere.
Yeah,
I suppose they're concentrated in like rich countries.
They're definitely concentrated in rich countries, yeah.
Because an interesting thing is the if we're thinking about this over hundreds or thousands of years, then the thing that determines maybe how many books would make it is how expensive is it to copy them.
Yeah.
So it could become quite important. How quickly do we get printing presses going again? Because the issue in India wasn't that like if everyone had been like rediverted to like copying books, then they could have sustained a much larger corpus, like copying it again and again. But reproducing books was so expensive then. You have to have someone who's like very educated and literate, like copying it out word for word and checking it. And so like the more expensive it is because the more frequently you have to do it because the wetter it is, like the smaller the more important the book has to be to bother keeping it around. And so the corpus becomes narrower.
Yep.
But I guess as long as we can get we will have printing presses. Printing presses, very like noticeable big machines of metal.
Yeah. They don't.
So hopefully like within 100 years or 200 years, someone would figure out how to do typesetting again. And then this is like giving you the potential to keep copying like decaying books at like some reasonable rate.
Yep. That sounds right.
The other thing is, I guess, cars rust maybe surprisingly quickly. Within decades, they can become pretty unrecognizable. But you would hope that even if there's only 80,000 people left somewhere, they'd be like, well, let's just take this car and like stick it somewhere that's like not extremely wet. And like maybe we can't reverse engineer this right now, but this seems like it will be useful in future. Yeah. I guess because it's just if we had to, how stupid are these people going to be?
Exactly.
The question is like, but I mean, it's an open question. Maybe they'll just be like so focused on the here and now that they're not very interested in preserving things for future. But it seems like even in the past, people had museums and they cared about retaining cool artifacts from the past.
Yeah, individual variation even will mean that some people might not care about this, but some probably will. And there are just lots of different ways to preserve information. I mean, you can store the car somewhere. You can also try to make detailed diagrams. That'll be like a lower fidelity copy, but it will still accelerate the future reinvention of cars.
Yeah.
I do feel pretty comfortable with the amount of knowledge and the types of knowledge preservation that they'll be able to do.
Because one thing that seems like it might be challenging to get back up to is computers. It seems like we can store a laptop. I'm just looking at my MacBook over here. It's a piece of aluminium with some plastic. It seems like if you stuck that in a basement somewhere, it could still be pretty recognizable in hundreds of years. But it's going to take a long time before we have enough people, like the industrial base required to be like manufacturing laptops again, or probably any really sophisticated electronics.
Yep.
I think maybe that's like one thing where it's like we've had this transition to these new materials that we've like embedded in every goddamn thing that we don't really know, like almost no one really knows how to make them or how they work, at least like not people that I know. Yeah. And this has created this sense of mystery about like how the world functions that probably people didn't have 100 years ago. 100 years, I guess I'm sure they had like lots of advanced things, but like far more items would have been recognizably, understand how they work, understand how you would make them in principle.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we'd be much less likely to get some of those technologies back. I think, again, there's kind of a correlation between how recognizable the thing is and how useful it is. And even though we've replaced some really useful technologies with really complicated versions, like, I don't know, harvesting combiners or something.
It's a much simpler version that does the job kind
of.
Yeah,
and they do. It's not like they don't exist anymore. Yeah. We still have lots of people around the world pulling crops out of the ground with more rudimentary tools, and they would survive to some extent. I guess maybe the thing doing the work here is like, there's just currently a lot of variation in the technologies used to do important things. And so while lots of places have complex technologies that have been substituted for simpler ones, lots of places are still using simple ones.
Another thing that's not going anywhere is glass, or it doesn't break down that fast, and was super valuable for science. I guess really a useful material for a whole lot of stuff. Yeah. So I suppose we have like good reason to think that there'll be quite a lot of written records around, there'll be quite a lot of artifacts around that people could admire and copy. I guess perhaps a bit more of an X factor is we don't know what culture this group might establish. And it seems like there's been like quite a range of how motivated different societies have been to like copy things from the past or to like copy their neighbors, and how motivated they are by science, especially when it gets hard or like is perhaps a bit less directly practical. Yeah, well, is there much that we can learn from history about what's the possibility of them, like people volunteering to be stagnant through their culture?
Right. Yeah. So I guess one response is that there will just be a diversity of cultures as there were kind of the first time around. And you might think, though it doesn't have to be true, that there's advantages to being a more technologically exploratory society. And so maybe there'll just be some selection for those societies. But even if not, by chance and variation, just like happened the first time. You'd think that some would be more exploratory than others. And then examples the kind of first time around of cases where societies truly seemed extremely motivated to adopt technologies that they saw like modeled in other cultures. A really good one is Japan famously had the Meiji Restoration, where they not only they just decided, after not having adopted technologies that had been around for centuries. So I think they were using swords to fight duels instead of guns, which had existed for a long time. So they were just very technologically stagnant for political reasons. That was the preference.
Yeah, as I recall, the emperor, was it Emperor of Japan at that point? Well, yeah, whoever was leading it, they were not keen on Japan copying other countries. They were like, Japan, we're the best. We're going to like close ourselves off and
we
keep
have
things
tradition.
the same.
And exactly. It was a very
it's an active choice.
Yeah, the culture of value tradition. So there's an example of culture really evaluating non-technological progress. And then they decided they did want to modernize, I think inspired by seeing war fleets of other countries and realizing they were really at risk of being invaded.
I think, I recall there's this amazing historical episode where so the Japanese didn't want to trade with anyone, basically. Yeah. I think there'd been some like temporary development of trade with Europe, and then they were again like, no, we don't like you guys. Go to hell. And I think the Americans, along with, maybe it was just the Americans, they sent their navy basically into the Bay of Tokyo and were like, you got to trade with us or we're going to attack you. And
we're really big.
Here's a treaty, you got to sign it, or we're like, our navy is just vastly better than yours.
Right.
And they were forced at the point of a gun to like agree to trade with the rest of the world so that like America could make money.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, they signed it. They weren't fans of it. So then they changed their mind. Or they changed their approach.
Right. And they decided they wanted to become as technologically advanced to become a comparable power. Yes. And the thing that I found really interesting is that, one, there was like a cultural shift that's kind of interesting, but the way they modernized so quickly is in part by sending Japanese scouts to European countries to observe different technologies in all sorts of different industries, so not just weapons, and literally bring some of the technologies home to like be disassembled, better understood, and then recreated.
And it worked, right?
And it worked. They had modernized extremely quickly.
I guess it seems like that's a standout case. It seems so surprising for a culture, for a whole country to like turn on a dime here and go from maximum tradition to like, we got to modernize. I suppose there was a lot of military external pressure requiring it. I guess it's possibly a cultural stereotype, or like maybe that's too salient here, but I guess it's like a very cohesive society that might have found it easier to like orient around a national mission being set.
Right.
And maybe even if they weren't using advanced industrial technology, they had the necessary social technology in a sense of like coordinating people in like very sophisticated ways and institutions that perhaps allowed them to modernize more quickly than otherwise. But anyway, the broader point is they took a bunch of artifacts, they put them apart, and they figured out how they worked.
If anything, the point I can imagine taking from the fact that they turned on a dime is more like, it took a lot of social coordination to maintain the traditions they did for as long as they did. Like, that seems like the surprising
thing. Weird one.
Yeah. Everyone else was slowly developing new technologies, like individuals in other societies were, because it's actually really hard to suppress or whatever. That's my view of it, is something like innovation was happening.
Yeah. So I suppose it suggests if one place is innovating, then over time they either become more powerful relative to others or other people have to copy.
Yeah. And that's the kind of selection argument I was pointing out earlier. Yeah.
So you would need lots of humanity to converge around a like less progress.
Yeah,
approach.
exactly.
Seems hard to fathom. I guess I'm reminded of the thing from June where they have the war. So in the June series, I think I've only read a tiny fraction of it.
I like started it.
Yeah, it's a long, arduous book.
Really tedious.
I hear there's a movie coming out.
Yeah.
I was saving myself for the movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think long before the books start, there's like an AI war, I think called the Butlerian Jihad from memory. And basically this is like AI apocalypse war where like the humans win and defeat the AI and then they ban computers forever.
Yes. So that's the main story here for why culture would be averse to technological advancement.
Yeah.
And that just seems like for all humans that survived to indefinitely coordinate to suppress innovation just seems really like a hard story to tell again. So it's like all the individuals need to either agree, which seems hard and has never happened, or you need the individuals who do agree to keep power, even though they're like, I guess you could think that they have access to a bunch of technology that allows them to maintain power.
I mean, a big problem here is, well, I don't know. In my imagination, I'm thinking, wow, okay, let's say there's like a colony in South America. Like, there's a Northern Hemisphere's a write-off, but there's like a colony in South America, like some people in Africa and some people in New Zealand / Australia. Over time, certainly over hundreds of years, they'll be spreading north. They'll be going like back to these like new places. And like necessarily the whole point is that the technology isn't such that it's like super easy to get to these places or to coordinate or to have like the internet.
Yeah.
So it's like these places are going to become more like not going to be possible to be controlled from like Christchurch.
Right,
So
right.
So now you've got like the same kind of fragmentation that we had through almost all of human history until like the very modern era. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just really hard to imagine. Yeah, either universal agreement or universal control. We just haven't seen it.
Yeah, I guess and it would be understandable perhaps if a very strong culture developed against nuclear weapons, for example, and then there was there was a huge fight over like whether to redevelop nuclear weapons or perhaps a massive effort to destroy them. But like even in the June
totally
story, right, they get rid of AIs, but they don't get rid of, I don't know, cars or spaceships, as it turns out. But,
technology is in some ways not a cohesive concept.
Yeah.
Where like because one thing caused this terrible thing to happen to civilization, like it wasn't all of technology.
Yeah, it wasn't the plow.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, in a deep sense, maybe it was the plow.
Right. Yeah.
It requires a lot of restraint to not use plows because of the long-term consequences.
Yes.
All right, so we've discussed how there would likely be a whole lot of artifacts that would give our descendants a big boost in the post-apocalypse, and there'll be lots of information lying around that would help them out, and that it'll be pretty unlikely for everyone to avoid pursuing science and technology for a really extended period of time, the kind of thing that would involve lots of coordination and culture not changing over time. I think the last major reason that people raise for why we might recover slowly or not at all is resource scarcity. Us, having used up things like fossil fuels and that being a big impediment to redevelopment. Yeah, why aren't you convinced by that argument?
Yeah, so it is true that we've used lots of fossil fuels. There still are tons. It's also true that lots of the ones that are left, while there are tons, are much harder to access without the kinds of technology we have now. But there's at least a lot of coal that seems pretty accessible. So, for example, there's a mine in, I think it's Montana, that has more coal, and it's surface coal, so it's coal that you could just like dig out with a shovel, has more coal than was used in the first, I think, 60 or 70 years of the Industrial Revolution, from like 1770 to 1830, which is just already getting you a chunk of the way to then being able to harvest a bunch more, maybe slightly harder to access fossil fuel.
Okay, so coal there's still a lot of. I guess I can't remember how much we've used of all of the coal that we think is out there. I think it's like closer to 10% than 100%.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so coal isn't such a big problem. So I guess if push came to shove, we could use coal as a fossil fuel as an alternative to oil. I guess there's benefits of liquid fuels, but again, it's like hard to see that would be absolutely make or break for industrial civilization developing.
Yeah.
And I think there are methods for converting coal into oil. But
yeah, I think that's true too.
It's a bit messy, but yeah.
Yep.
What about, I guess this raises the question, we're going to talk a bit more about climate change later, but I suppose people might then worry that future groups rebuilding on the back of coal exclusively would end up doing themselves in by burning so much coal. And I guess, yeah, that actually seems kind of plausible if you, like, back of the envelope suggests that if you burn like 2 or 3 times as much coal as we've used so far again, then we'd be in deep trouble. Yeah, any comments on that?
Yeah. I think it basically is plausible. It seems like that's one possible outcome. I guess one thing pushing in the other direction is like, while on the one hand, I feel reasonably confident that there are enough fossil fuels to like kind of restart things, there will be less. And that will put even more pressure on recovering civilization to switch to alternatives. And that will be a bit harder because at first there will be worse technology, but then it'll also be a lot easier because we'll already have examples of renewable energy technologies lying around.
Yeah.
And there are also just some, more renewable forms of energy that we aren't using much, that don't require much technology at all, that different countries rely much more on than Western countries. So Brazil, for example, makes tons of charcoal, which burns cleaner than fossil fuels and is just enormously kind of efficient. And we don't use it because it's harder to grow all the forests necessary to cut down the trees that you need to make into charcoal, which you do by pyrolyzing wood.
What's pyrolyzing?
It's like a form of converting like a wood or bark that has a certain carbon structure into a much denser carbon structure.
It's like you kind of dehydrate it and turn it into, you dehumidify it and then turn it into coal, basically, or something like coal.
Basically an equivalent to coal.
Yeah.
And that could easily supplement the Industrial Revolution. And if there was scarcity with fossil fuels, then like there would be even more incentive to use charcoal. And maybe that would even put us in a better place relative to where we are now. Yeah, that's just like one alternative. The situation you suggested also sounds totally plausible to me. Yeah, especially I guess if there's like a memory of the threat of climate change. Like it's not like the first time around we kind of didn't know what we were doing. The second time around, maybe we'd have more.
Have a heads up.
Yeah,
I guess we'll come back to this, but I can see kind of maybe three scenarios. One might be that they make kind of the same mistake that we did and don't do enough to reduce their reliance on coal soon enough, just because they're foolish. So it was possible, but they didn't do it. Another scenario would be that actually they just do. They're able to switch over to, I guess oil and gas. Maybe they'll be able to like extract that again before too long. You've got examples of wind and solar that they can then copy. And then before too long, they're kind of in a similar situation to where we are, which is bad, but not like necessarily catastrophic. And the third category would be, well, actually, we've now used up so much of the easily available oil and gas, say, and it turns out to be really hard to reinvent, say, all the electronics that go into solar and nuclear and so on. You actually just need an enormous population, say, in order to be able to sustain those industries. But then it actually isn't possible for them to reach a like low carbon energy system, or at least like not practical in the real world. So I guess I feel the pessimists are getting like a bit of a point here.
I completely agree. It seems like that seems like one of the most plausible routes to something like stagnation or a kind
oscillation.
Of exactly that we can talk more about in a bit.
Okay. Any other resources other than coal that are worth mentioning?
So people worry about phosphorus, which is in a lot of fertilizers and is really important for the levels of crop yields that we have today. And originally we got it from, I think, guano.
Food.
Poop.
Built up on islands over very, very long periods of time.
Exactly. And I guess I've been told that that's been basically harvested. So we'd basically be relying on phosphorus already in the environment. So we'd have to use dead plants, like let them decompose and then use them as fertilizer, which is definitely less efficient. Eventually we get to the point where we are now, which is we invent technology again to be able to put phosphorus back into fertilizers more easily.
Okay, so not having these piles of phosphorus lying around would be inconvenient. But again, it seems like agriculture can work without extra phosphorus. It did for most of history, I suppose.
Most of history,
and so it's, again, an inconvenience, something that might slow us down a bit. But how can this be make or break, the access to like additional supplies of phosphorus, given that there already is phosphorus in the environment, in the soil? Possibly we'd have to be more choosy exactly about where we farm, but shouldn't be the end of the world again.
Exactly. I think this is basically true of lots of resources that you can try to think of that might be limiting to the successor society or the recovering society. And basically, it's like there are a few things that seem pretty important and that we'd either need to access again or find good substitutes for. There are lots of things that are really important to the like level of abundance that we have today, but that exist at levels that are easily accessible that would be like enough to get recovery going. And then we could reach the level of technological sophistication we have to like get back up to these levels of abundance. So that includes things like phosphorus, but also nitrogen, which currently we have like really complex and energetically intensive systems for fixing nitrogen, which we'd lose, but we just still have environmental sources that would be like, again, more limited, but like enough to grow crops.
Okay, so we've got energy, which is this kind of flow resource. I guess phosphorus and nitrogen are also kind of flow resources because we concentrate them or we extract them and then we like let them dissipate. So it's like very hard to concentrate them again. Or it takes a lot of energy in the case of nitrogen, and I'm not sure exactly how we do it with phosphorus, but it's presumably some way. I guess there's another class of materials which are like stock materials, like steel or iron or aluminum, other stuff that we use, but then it's still there.
Yeah.
It's just in our buildings now, and maybe it's a pain in the ass to access it again. But I guess it was often a pain in the ass to get bronze and steel and iron and so on out of the ground in the first place.
Totally. Yeah. So there's variation in exactly how hard it would be to reuse resources like that are lying around. So, for example, I think, I should check which, but some metals that will like exist in cities, for example, you can just remelt. This is true for some plastics too. Basically, like some things would just be like, make heat, melt the thing, make a new thing with the material. And then others are like, I think rubber is an example where you like can't melt it down and remake the same thing. Heating it changes a structure or something in a way that changes the properties you're looking for. And so those we basically have to
go again.
Yeah.
I see.
Which is definitely annoying.
Yeah.
I mean, things like blast furnaces and like basically all the methods we use for metalworking, they're like kind of complicated, but also have existed for at least a millennium in some societies. So they don't seem show-stopping to me.
Yeah. I've seen these videos on YouTube of this guy. He never speaks, but he manages to go from having no resources whatsoever in a forest to making a furnace of sorts that I think he can... Yeah, where he's able to, for example, fire ceramics. And I think I haven't gotten to this video yet, but I think he does start melting down metals and extracting metals. So using this kiln, and he literally has gone out into the forest with nothing except the knowledge that he has in his head. I guess it's probably not at the level of a blast furnace, but it suggests that people. I mean, I think people did figure out that they could use heat to extract stuff from the ground pretty early on. It was an early step.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And Louis Dartnell has a great, going back to his book, The Knowledge, has a chapter on harnessing heat. I think that's the unifying theme. But he basically describes how to build a kiln. And the great thing about a kiln is it holds heat so well that you can get to like 1,500 degrees or something, like extremely high temperatures. And then once you have those temperatures, you can make things like cast iron or like things that you basically can't make over a fire. But the way he does this is by like, first you have to build the bricks and the bricks have to be able to sustain that heat. And the way you build the bricks is also by like, I think it's by creating like a somewhat more makeshift kiln that can also reach temperatures high enough to fire bricks. And so it's basically this process of like...
it's like a success spiral.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are similar examples in metalworking. There are like kind of cool books and videos actually similar to the one you're talking about, where a like skilled metal worker shows how with scraps of metal, he can create a whole metalworking shop just by first building tools like screws and lathes, basically. And then by like building the rudimentary things, you can build much more complex things. And I think it really demystified. Yeah, I can't imagine what it's like to build a blast furnace, but all of these processes do kind of happen in incremental steps. And each one, once I learned a bit more about it, I was like, oh, I can imagine going from the thing before. That sounds...
It makes a lot of sense.
Very doable to me. Yeah. You don't have to like reinvent complex technologies. You like invent small things. Maybe you find the small things like screws lying around, and that means you go even faster. But it is much more incremental than I think I intuitively had in mind.
Are there any other resources that are worth mentioning that you looked into at least briefly?
Yeah. So I did think about glass. Basically, you make sand incredibly hot to make glass. And the first glass ever was lightning would strike sand and it would create these shards of glass that could then be worked at high temperatures. And basically, that's just how people realized glass was a thing and began to use it. And that gets you to some like pretty advanced technologies like lenses and lenses for viewing really tiny things, lenses for making eyesight better. It also allows you to make windows. So glass doesn't seem like a scarce resource, though I'm not sure. I haven't thought much about whether you could melt it down from existing windows or something. But I think it's something that would
doesn't seem necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Silicon's underrated. It's highly rated, but maybe just an underrated element. So many uses.
Yes, really,
the little building block that could. Yeah, anything else worth mentioning, or shall we move on, basically? I guess it seems like a lot of people talk about this resource scarcity thing as being an impediment. And maybe at first blush it sounds plausible, but then it just seems like it's another one that the more you inspect it, the more it melts away into air.
Yeah, that sounds right. I think fossil fuels are kind of the most plausible, especially in a scenario where it's like the 10th collapse catastrophe, maybe even more than 10th. I could look back. I did a few calculations to be like, at what point would we like just actually have run out of fossil fuels if we like repeated the exact same process? Yeah, several times in a row. But it just looks like we at least have another go, if not many more goes.
Yeah, interesting. I guess there are still some oil wells that produce oil relatively straightforwardly. And I guess we're imagining them rebuilding with a much lower population than we have now. So they could at least get started with that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, you either have large enough populations that you're not losing nearly as much technology and you're pulling things out more easily, or you have tiny populations and you don't need much.
Okay, so we've discussed all of the main streams of reasons that people offer for why we might, even in the long term, not really recover to where we are today. We're kind of skeptical about all of them. Taking now the assumption that we're right about that, and indeed we would recover, how fast could we expect population to rebound if things go well?
Yeah, so basically population growth, I guess, is kind of an example of how hard it is to grasp, or how hard it is to intuitively understand how quick compounded growth is. But if you think the population would grow at the fastest level that it ever has, which is in the 1960s, that was about 2.2% per year, then you'd get about a tenfold increase in population every 100 years. So if you lost 90% of the population, you'd be back to current levels within 100 years. And then if you think that population is going to grow slower, so maybe the level it did when humans were just agriculturalists, then you could recover a population from 90% population loss to current levels in about 240 years, which is still really, really fast.
Yeah, it's kind of shockingly fast, or it seems like it should take ages. But I suppose it's just the magic of exponential growth means that it doesn't take quite as long as you think. If people can keep having kids at a decent clip.
Exactly. Yeah. So even the most kind of pessimistic scenarios I think we thought of were if 99.999% of people died, which is a huge number of people dying, then at kind of that 1%, so agriculturalist level of population growth, you'd still expect the population to reach current levels in about 1,200 years.
Okay.
So
I suppose we could compound all these scenarios into an even more pessimistic one where you have 99.9% gone and you're only growing at the hunter-gatherer level, which was 0.1%.
Yeah, that's right.
Might I just have a go?
Please, yeah. How long would it take?
We just paused the recording and did the calculation and would get back to the original population in 7,000 years.
Wow.
I guess maintaining a 0.1% population growth rate the entire time just seems
really
very
implausible.
Strange. Yeah, because it's it seems like it should either be below zero or more above zero than that. That's just like knife edge level.
That's like, it would be really surprising if at 6 billion, we were still going at like hunter-gatherer levels of growth rates.
Yeah. I guess even then, like 7,000 years, it's not so long. So that shows that even on a very negative case scenario, it's still very, very, very possible to rebuild.
Yep.
I suppose I don't have a great intuition for whether we should expect population growth to be fast or slow in the rebuilding stage relative to what it was historically. I suppose on the one hand, you've got all of the chaos and problems created by the original catastrophe, which presumably would hold people back, at least in the immediate term. On the other hand, that'd be recovering all of these technologies potentially really like a lot faster than we invented them the first time around.
Right.
And at the same time, we're in this massive disequilibrium with the number of people relative to the size of the Earth.
Exactly.
I guess, and especially if we had like massive population loss, like more than 90%, 99 or 99.9%, then there's just so much space for people to spread out. It's like everywhere is a frontier to go and do much more farming.
Exactly.
Unless we've somehow completely trashed the Earth. But I think even nuclear war doesn't reduce long-term farming capacity really hardly at all.
No, not beyond a decade.
Yeah. So I guess it's possible that the regrowth rate could be faster than 2.3%. Maybe instead what we should look at the population growth rate among farmers, say, settling an area where they were able to just kill everyone who was already there and then just like settle it themselves.
Right.
I don't know how fast that was, but I mean, I think the population growth in the early United States was extremely fast.
Yeah, I was going to say the Americas would probably be a good case study to look at. And I don't actually know exactly what the population growth was there, but I think you're totally right. I mean, like, on the one hand, there might be some cultural pressures against having kids. It's just,
because
like,
they could invent birth control earlier.
That's true. I guess even then, you have plenty of societies that have birth control today that still have much higher birth rates than other countries with birth control.
Yeah.
And
so then we're back to this argument that even if the mainstream of society develops a culture that doesn't support having, more than 2 children, say, then some subgroups will have that culture, and then eventually they will end up being most of the population before too long.
Yeah. All that has to happen is that not everyone agrees to have as few kids as possible, or like not have very many kids. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's enough on population regrowth rates. So people can go and check out your blog post if they want even more permutations of different scenarios and how long it would take.
Yeah.
Maybe just to wrap up this section on indirect routes to extinction, how long it would take to recover and the problems in the meantime. What's the biggest doubt you have about the lines of argument that you're pursuing here? That, like, how would you be most likely to be wrong, perhaps?
Yeah. In general, I think I'm biased toward optimism. So I'm like more likely to think that if something is technologically possible, it will also be what happens, especially if it like seems intuitively advantageous for it to. And that's not always the case. Yeah. So I guess something like in some systematic ways, the survivors are like much worse at taking advantage of all the things working in their favor than I predicted. I guess another, which we'll talk about soon, is like most of the scenarios we've talked about so far have effects that are kind of limited to a time period. And if there are catastrophes that have effects that last thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of years.
Like the disaster doesn't go away.
Exactly. Yeah. If it's just like, oh, the world's just worse now. And like maybe humanity can't rebuild agriculture because it's just forever going to be too cold or forever going to be too hot or forever going to have acid rain.
And we can't learn to adapt to it somehow or evolve to be able to cope with it.
Yeah. And so I think that's kind of an unknown set of scenarios.
Yeah. I guess just the other stream of doubts might be something that we haven't thought of. Once again, it doesn't seem like these arguments are very persuasive, though some of them get some weight. But maybe there's some other argument that hasn't been raised yet. Because it's just there's a lot of arguments that one could make in this space.
Right. Yeah, it feels endless. Yeah, maybe an example of that is just the resources. Maybe there really are some showstoppers without substitutes that I haven't thought of.
Yeah. Could we rebuild without Netflix? So, inquiring minds want to know.
Yeah.
Okay, pushing on. Let's talk about whether this has any implications about what we ought to do in the here and now. This wasn't at all the focus of the project. Here you were just trying to of produce forecasts. But it's possible that incidentally you've thought of some things that might be helpful for us to do now. Yeah, do you think there's any low-hanging fruit that we should engage in to try to make it easier, perhaps to recover in future after a severe catastrophe?
Yeah, so there are the like advantages that I talked about. So this is like stuff flying around and examples of useful technologies that'll be left over, I think will be helpful. But there are ways to just make it easier to just hand them to survivors. And I haven't thought that much about what these are, but like a great example of this already being thought of and existing is the seed bank in
Norway, I think.
Norway, thanks.
Svalbard.
Yes, Svalbard, exactly. But
I think London has a pretty good seed bank as well.
Oh, really?
Although I guess that one's going up in smoke in the nuclear scenario. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. So actually, kind of on that vein, thinking more about where we want to conserve both physical resources and information, given the types of catastrophes that we think are likely, like maybe a nuclear war between Western countries or just countries in the global north. Yeah, thinking about what things we want to keep. So the seed bank does a great job of keeping heirloom seeds, which are seeds that do produce viable seeds when grown, like prioritizing those seeds, keeping in like a similar vein, stocks of things that would be both useful to use and also useful to learn from in like a more intentional and curated way, like on the same theme of like banks. Like, what do we want the
technology
bank of?
banks?
Yeah, exactly.
Here's tons of artifacts, all nicely conserved.
Exactly.
They're going to last quite a long time. And next to each thing is a book describing how it works.
A plaque or a book, even better. Exactly. Yeah. And then just being deliberate about distributing those globally and like
sticking them under mountains and places
making
that
sure
can
they
still
get
be
preserved.
accessed. And...
I would love one on a sub. I'd love one in Antarctica. Who knows? So something a bit more strategic there. I think there are concrete things that can be done to make infrastructure more resilient. And there are like organizations and cities trying to make their infrastructure more robust to things like cascading power outages caused by weather or something. And probably there are like really targeted things you could do to make infrastructure have fewer interdependencies so that it's like easier to bring back online if like one part failed. But yeah, this is something on the level of city governments or even state governments having to think this through. But again, currently we're doing great things on infrastructure resilience, but only for types of disasters that are like pretty small scale. So like storms, basically.
Yeah.
And if we just thought a little bit harder about these large scale disasters, there might be some low hanging fruit, though I don't know all about what they would be.
The electrical grid resiliency we've talked about at least once on the show before with David Rudman, because he was looking into the solar storm stuff.
Yeah.
I think since that interview, there has been a bit of talk about this, and there are some people doing experiments trying to design, I guess it's transformers, one of the weak points. There's discussion among electrical engineers and people who run these grids about this kind of thing. I suspect relative to what's optimal, it's not enough. But if you were someone who had relevant expertise, that's a group that you could potentially try to join in on that conversation of how do we protect ourselves against EMPs or against solar storms. I guess the project to like distribute technology and information into lots of locations, convenient locations around the world, and then make sure that people know that they can go find that information there should the worst happen. That seems like something that, you know, a listener among this, if they don't have a job, like they could potentially get going on that. I suppose it would cost some money to actually implement it. It would cost a bunch of money. You just have to, I don't know, build a vault or whatever.
Yeah,
exactly. But to start producing the plans and start producing the materials in order to then be able to say, well, this is what we would put in there, and I want to make a pitch that this is worth doing to some big philanthropist or a government. It seems like surprisingly easy, perhaps, to just start working on it, basically, and then maybe other people could join in.
Yeah, I basically think that's right. Yeah, some like components of the project would be maybe like interviewing experts to see what kinds of technologies you'd want stored, like thinking about the types of knowledge, so like which books you'd want to have, maybe going back and reading Lewis Dartnell's The Knowledge and thinking of more examples of things like heirloom seeds or yeast or things that it would just be kind of a leapfrog, save you some trouble to have stored somewhere. So like thinking of the things is one step. Building the things is obviously a costly step. Deciding where to put the things, I think would be really achievable.
Yeah.
I think it's like, in general, you can't go wrong with like distributed all over the world. And then there's some pretty clear other factors that might push you toward certain places that I think you could just kind of work out. Like places that seem like they'd be more likely to have survivors. And then governments have plans that you can download online that are like, what should I do if there are massive kind of disasters that force me to leave my home and basically there aren't services for a long time. And if you just included a bit, like I can imagine advocating for something to be inserted into those plans that's like just a location of where these vaults are or something. Yeah.
You might not really, I think there's just actually quite a lot of abandoned vaults out there in the world. And as I understand it, Switzerland has just enormous space in its vaults.
Interesting.
They had some plan where all of Switzerland was meant to be able to fit in vaults like simultaneously if there was a nuclear war.
That's wild. I've never heard that.
Maybe you should go fact check that.
Okay.
But I think it's like, it's absolutely bananas, the amount of like space that they have.
Huh.
I think the reason that the stockpile of knowledge and materials, the reason that it feels like it's something that hobbyists could work at is perhaps because it's not going to expire. Like if you could come up with a great plan for that now, and then you kind of put it on ice for 10 years, it seems like the plan would probably still be quite reasonable 10 years later. So you don't have to kind of bring together all of the aspects of it simultaneously.
Right.
As long as people who are going to take that project forward in future realize that there's a prior art that's been done that they should just grab in the first place. Yeah,
right. Yeah, you could design the vault and come up with an inventory for everything in it. And you just have that, and then someone else could implement it and maybe add 2 technologies that we've come up with since. And that'd be pretty great.
Yeah, for those who are curious, we discussed an even more extreme case of this in the second interview with Paul Cristiano, where we talked about how would you leave a message, not just for 100 or 1,000 years away, but a million years in the future. And that turns out to be a lot more challenging. But Paul Cristiano had some ideas for how you might do it.
Oh, that's so cool.
On the other stream, you're raising about making things more resilient now, or making things have less interdependencies. California and the EU, they actually regularly pass rules about criteria that electronics have to meet around privacy or around interconnectivity. I wonder whether there should be a rule that say all cars or like all of these devices have to be able to continue operating without the internet.
Right, that's a great one. We just don't
want all of these things to disappear, suddenly start malfunctioning after some period of time in an unforeseen way because they lost internet. Yeah,
I mean, lots of the interdependencies are, they're just financially advantageous. You get huge gains in efficiency when you're like adding in complexity, and the complexity is buying you efficiency. And so it would just take a bit of regulation to be like, you can't have that much complexity. It makes the system too fragile. And then I can totally imagine, a ballot campaign in California that's like, make the power grid robust to like two important disasters that seem reasonably plausible. And maybe it involves some like trip wires that make it so that like a blackout in one place doesn't cause blackout in another, which is like very plausibly would happen given most current cities' infrastructures.
Yeah, I think I can imagine a California ballot initiative. I think that might become a joke line after a while. It seems like you can pass almost anything on a California ballot initiative at this point.
Yeah.
But maybe that's part of the beauty of ballot initiatives is it allows specific states to try all kinds of wacky stuff.
Totally.
That sounds good to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so any other low-hanging fruit we should potentially consider that you've struck on?
Yeah, I think David Denkenberger talked about food stocks. We used to have way more. It'd probably be good if we had way more again. It'd probably be good if more countries had more. And that, I don't know how hard that'd be to advocate for. But yeah, it's something that we're doing worse on than we were even 40 years ago. So it just seems like we could improve upon that again. I guess in general, I'm like in favor of all the research being done into alternative foods. I don't know exactly what will work. I know Alfred works on this. I'm
actually interviewing him next week. So
are you?
So we can, maybe
I'll leave it to him.
That.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, but I basically think it would be great if there were some blueprints for how to make food if it's really cold or really hot. Anything else? I don't know. We used to joke morbidly. So like when I was looking at the absolute worst case scenarios where like we're down to tens of thousands of people, I was looking for ways that those people might be systematically worse at rebuilding society than larger groups that are more randomly selected across the world. And I was like, okay, who are the people if we're down to 10,000? Maybe it's people in submarines. Maybe it's people disproportionately in the military, or maybe the opposite. But yeah, I joked with some colleagues that if it was submarines that made up disproportionate numbers of survivors, we'd have, I think, a ratio of like 1 woman to 99 men. So even just like, I don't actually know if this is like low-hanging fruit worth plucking or like something to take seriously, but like
having a
women
more
on
equal gender
submarines
ratio on nuclear subs.
could be good from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, someone on Twitter had this question for you. How has Louisa's research on civilizational collapse affected her views on long-termism or intra-long-termist cause prioritization?
Yeah, nice. I guess the main way is that for the most part, relative to where I was before looking into it, I think relatively fewer resources should go to catastrophes that would cause something like collapse, but not extinction. And so I guess maybe that kind of includes nuclear war and maybe natural pandemics. I still think more should be going to those things than are currently going to those things. It's not that I think like long-termists shouldn't think they're important, but relative to something like AI risk, or even just there are some like speculative causes like making sure that technology doesn't stagnate and that we actually kind of realize the potential of kind of sentient flourishing or something. And
or perhaps the values don't stagnate.
Values is the other one. Yeah, making sure that if we do last for a really long time, we don't do so with really horrible values, or that we at least don't miss out on like some amazing ones. So I guess those just seem a bit more important to me. But I do worry that this might be interpreted as meaning that I don't think it's great for people to work on catastrophes that would cause collapse. And yeah, I think I still just like, if there's a great position for you in one of those fields, and that seems like your comparative advantage or something that you'd be especially good at working on, that seems amazing. And yeah, again, want more resources on all of these problems on the margin.
Yeah, I guess two factors there are, although we feel pretty good about our chances of recovering, we can't be sure. Oh, it's like maybe we're like 90% confident, even 99% confident. That might not be dispositive in terms of what you ought to decide to do with your career.
Yeah.
And I guess, as we talked about recently in the episode with Carl Schulman, there's other reasons, like other moral values that you might have for wanting to prevent 99% of people dying, other than it prevents the long-term future of humanity going to space and things like that.
Absolutely.
We might just not want that to happen for all kinds of other reasons.
Maybe it would just be terrible if 7.7 billion people died.
Yeah.
That does seem unimaginably awful.
Yeah, I guess it does still seem like the recovery collapse cycle still seems like a live option. And actually, we're about to talk about the boom and bust climate change stuff in a minute, which does leave open this option that even if we don't go completely extinct, we might fail to achieve humanity's full potential due to a collapse or a series of them.
Yeah. No, I think that is still a live option. And and there are like some scenarios, and again, the unknown unknowns that give me pause enough that these still seem terrible. And I mean, it would be terrible to be wrong in a bunch of different ways. Would not want to, find out I'm wrong because we in fact go extinct. Because I told everyone. Exactly. But maybe I'd be one of the final 5 and I'd be like, darn it, I should have told people to invest more in this.
Should have put my money in phosphorus.
Exactly.
Cool. All right, let's push on and talk about climate change for a bit. I guess we've been teasing this over the last half hour, but I think people are going to really enjoy this section. So I saw a preview of this long-termist book that Will is writing, and I guess that you've been a major contributor to. And he spends some time trying to come up with kind of worst-case scenarios for climate change. I guess as part of his project of thinking about what if long-termism as a moral view is an important point, but we're not in an especially urgent moment right now. Say, we shouldn't expect AI to revolutionize things anytime soon. And in that case, it seems like climate change is going to be high up on the list of things that we'll be talking about from a long-termist point of view. Of course, one variable is how responsive the climate is to carbon emissions. That is to say, kind of how many degrees of warming you get if you double CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. But the part of the book that I saw focuses on a slightly different angle, which Will and you call boom and bust cycles. Yeah, can you explain in brief what is the underlying structure of a boom and bust scenario? And then I guess what were the 2 possible ways that could happen that you all envisaged?
Sure, yeah. And I'll just give lots of credit to Will, of course, and then also to John Halstead, who I think was probably more involved than me on this. But yeah, so in brief, boom and bust refers to, the boom refers to using a bunch of fossil fuels, which translate to high emissions and high temperature effects and other climate effects. And then the bust, at least broadly, is referring to, for some reason, not being able to bring carbon in the atmosphere back down to make those climate changes tolerable, mitigated. And specifically, Will and John, I think, came up with 2 ways that could happen. So in one scenario, you have a kind of, I think Will calls it the rise and fall scenario, which is, I think he's alluding to Rome, where there's no single catastrophe that means that we don't have climate mitigating technologies. It's just that our technological progress on climate mitigation stagnates before we're able to get to the whatever level necessary it is to get to carbon neutral. And then to suck more carbon out of the atmosphere to get temperature levels even lower if we've already gone up higher than we want to be. So that's one. The other one is a bust caused by some kind of catastrophe. And I think Will calls this one a double catastrophe, where the first catastrophe is something like, I think his best guess at how this happens is something like there's a great power conflict that is both demanding of technological innovation and attention. So brain power. I think the example he uses is I think basically he's imagining a scenario where much of our resources are being devoted to developing new military technologies to basically win some arms race. And because arms races are super energy intensive, we're also burning maybe even more fossil fuels than we would otherwise. And at the same time, that conflict is so politically charged that we are not following through with climate agreements. And so basically we just stop trying to bring carbon levels down and in fact are increasing them. And then maybe that particular conflict becomes a hot conflict by which I mean like war actually erupts. And maybe, it could be a nuclear war, it could be use of bioweapons, but something causes society to collapse more significantly in kind of like a single event. And then in that scenario, you've had all this carbon being released into the atmosphere, making everything hot and without a way to take it out. So things are just going to keep getting hotter. And you're now in a collapse scenario where we don't have the technology we'd need to, again, pull it out. And I think because we don't have the technology to pull it out, I guess the idea there is like, it's basically too hot in almost all areas of the world to exist without air conditioning as humans, but also to have livestock without air conditioning, and then also to grow some types of crops. And we don't have air conditioning technology. So we're like really limited.
Really in a tricky spot.
Exactly. Yeah.
So broadly, the story here is that you're searching for what are the ways that climate change could be the worst. Because if climate change went extremely badly, and I guess if it was complemented with another disaster as well, then the people who are trying to recover from this disaster could find themselves with such an inhospitable climate that it really slows them down or maybe just prevents them from getting back to where we are. So we're on the search for how could things get worse?
Yeah.
And then setting aside the climate responsiveness to carbon, which is kind of just a scientific fact that's out of human control or is not affected by geopolitics.
Yeah.
Then we need to think, wow, what's ways that the next 200 years could go such that we emit a hell of a lot, and then at the end of it, we don't really have much to show for it.
Yeah.
And I guess in scenario one, we've got like a long-term stagnation where productivity growth is pretty low. So humanity's not really advancing. Like AI turns out to be a pretty lame, doesn't actually accomplish all that much. And maybe green technology turns out to be, or like solar and wind turns out to be very hard to integrate into the grid, for example. So we turn back to fossil fuels more than ever, while at the same time not really like getting that much of an economic boost from it, because we're not inventing new things that make life better or make us able to do more. And then I guess at the end of that, you could just have kind of any disaster, or plausibly just we've emitted so much carbon now by burning like a large fraction of all of the coal that is there in pursuit of trying to make our lives better despite technological stagnation. That now we've got 17 degrees of warming and we're pretty toast. And that causes like a gradual, possibly even just a gradual decline of humanity. And then it's very hard to rebuild because we can kind of only live comfortably on the Antarctic.
Exactly.
In the second scenario, we've got kind of a Cold War potentially between two large powers. I'll let the audience guess which is most likely. And in order to keep up with one another, they're saying, wow, climate change, that's a problem for next century. We are going to just like burn all of this stuff in order to keep up, rather than wasting money building solar panels. And then all of the people who are working on, or most of the scientists working on green power, instead building like new weapons. And then maybe they do go to war eventually, and now we've got an enormous amount of carbon emissions from before hanging over us, while at the same time massively reduced population and infrastructure. Yeah, how likely do you think these things are? Did you get more worried working on this chapter?
Yeah, I think I did. I think these are basically, I don't know how likely they are, but they're like plausible, which is not a place I got to with most of the other attempts I made at telling these stories for like how we could actually get to extinction. So I guess with the rise and fall scenario, which is the one where we keep emitting, we like think technology is going to help us get out of it, but it doesn't. And then we're basically just in a hotter world, and we're not getting more technology out of it because it's for some reason too hard. And there are lots of reasons at play there. Then I guess we get lower and lower levels of economic growth, and this lasts a really long time. And I'm trying to imagine, I guess population you'd think would start to decline because you'd have like a lower quality of life, and people's quality of life would just get lower. They'd have fewer kids. And then eventually probably there'd be a kind of catastrophe, or like starvation, or not necessarily starvation, but famine. And I guess I imagine this as more of a slow petering out, and not necessarily people dying of starvation, but at least for a while, population declining because it doesn't, or no one's like willing to use a resource to have kids. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how we get all the way to extinction from that. Do you have ideas?
Yeah, I guess extinction is a high level, but I suppose you can imagine a scenario where, population is way down on where it was. With 17 degrees of warming, then we really are just confined to such a small area that maybe the population isn't at the level where you can support like a sufficient industrial base to be doing things like leaving Earth. Right.
I guess it's like, I can't really imagine extinction, but you can easily imagine if it just stops technological progress such that it basically rules out most of the potential for human civilization, then that's just about as bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we can imagine these humans stuck on Antarctica, if we're talking for a very long period of time, wouldn't they eventually like have an interest in doing geoengineering or something in order to reduce the temperature?
Yeah.
But I guess I haven't really put any thought into that. So
Yeah,
that feels
me
a little bit far down in the scenario envisioning. So with both of these, well, I guess we can call them the low productivity growth and the Cold War scenario. Each of like the component pieces is plausible, but maybe like together, like all of the pieces to go together, it's a bit of a conjunction that doesn't seem very likely. So I guess I don't think that it's very likely that we'll see low productivity growth over the next 100 or 200 years.
Yeah.
And I guess probably over that length of time, Will probably doesn't either, though he's more pessimistic about artificial intelligence than I am.
Right.
But yeah, so it has to go on for quite a long time. Then we also have to think that we're like not close enough now to coming up with substitutes for coal. And so coal is going to continue to be cost competitive or the cheapest thing for like many decades, possibly a century or something.
Yep.
That also kind of seems a bit unlikely to me. It seems like we're already on the cusp of these other options being better in a bunch of different ways. Yeah. And it's not only climate change that is causing people to move away from coal. It's the fact that it's incredibly bad for health is making countries like India and China, as well as the US and Europe, want to get rid of coal as soon as it's practical to get an alternative that isn't horrifically expensive.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. There are like lots of stories for why we might expect technological stagnation. Ideas getting harder to find and kind of a unit of progress taking many, many more researchers than it used to. But you do just have to believe that it's going to take an extremely long time to get the kind of gains from AI that we think we'll get. And that I guess that like all of the terrible climate change things will happen before we get back to higher productivity, which, I personally don't believe, but I don't feel confident ruling it out.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess biotech also has to be a bust, which would be
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like neither of those things seems likely, but neither of them seems super, super implausible either. Yeah. So it's worrying, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess one more on the stagnation one is that we also don't figure out how to do geoengineering in a way that's tolerable.
Right.
And I guess also we go past 5 degrees of warming and we just continue to do the same thing. We still don't come to any sort of agreement. I guess like, again, those two things are also plausible individually, but then now we've added kind of 4 different criteria.
Yeah. And the more criteria you get, the less likely it seems.
The conjunction seems less likely.
Yeah. It's a good point about geoengineering, given that it seems a bit unsettlingly easy to come up with ways to do geoengineering even for small groups. Certainly
at the point where we're talking about warming on that level where it's causing, a 90% loss of carrying capacity. It seems like now really the lesser evil is the geoengineering. Yeah, it's hard to tell a story where people wouldn't give it a crack.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Then on the Cold War scenario, again, a lot of tension between the US and China seems very plausible. At the same time, the US and the Soviet Union, I think, had like a much more intense Cold War than I would expect between the US and China, because the US and Soviet Union had far more conflicting ideologies and priorities and designs for the planet as a whole. Whereas it seems like the US and China, they have tension over a bunch of different issues, but they don't have like fundamentally conflicting goals.
Right.
Like the US doesn't think that it wants to take over China ideologically or otherwise, and China doesn't feel that way about the US.
Yep.
So how long can they really just be at one another's throats? And even during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, it's not as if they like burnt all of the coal that they could or diverted anywhere near 100% of GDP towards military stuff.
I used to know these facts.
Yeah, we'll maybe go take a look at a graph at military spending as a fraction of GDP for the US and USSR. But as I recall, it kind of capped out somewhere around 10% and then came down from there once they built up their nuclear stockpiles. So it's a lot of resources, but, the US spends 17% of its GDP on healthcare now.
Right.
So it's not like completely revolutionary. And I don't really see much appetite, even now with all the saber rattling about China for going even from 4 to 8% of GDP on military spending or anything like that.
Yeah.
It also seems like the kind of conflict that would be in would not be one that is primarily about material or primarily about like sending lots of tanks against one another or things that require burning tons of fuel. It seems like they're more concerned about strategic things. It's like missiles, it's fighter jets, it's like cyberspace stuff.
Right. Yeah. That sounds right to me. Also, do you happen to know what country has spent the greatest percentage of its GDP on war at one time?
I think this might have been in your notes somewhere.
Yeah, I thought it was.
Like Japan.
I think it's Japan, and I think it was really high.
Yeah, Japan during World War II in 1943 and 1944, where their backs were gradually getting put up against the wall and they saw that they were going to lose. I think they were spending more than half of GDP.
Yeah. Okay.
That's like a very abnormal. That's like total war at the point where you're just about to lose.
Right.
It's hard to see how they would sustain such an intense rivalry for decades, long enough to burn all of this coal.
Right.
And then it's hard to see if they actually got into a fight, how the fight would last long enough, because they've got such weapons that they would quickly cease to be functional countries.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to imagine the Cold War bit. Yeah, both being that energy intensive and that prolonged. Yeah. That climate change would get significantly worse.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is kind of the skepticism that I was bringing to it. Although again, I don't think it's a. If you were talking about like unlikely but possible things, this seems like it should certainly be, on the list, which is I guess why it's ended up in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any reasons that we haven't mentioned to think that it's plausible that we could have technological or economic stagnation in the 21st or 22nd century?
Yeah. So I think it's Tyler Cowen who talks about the possible great stagnation, which maybe we're already seeing signs of, where basically incremental technological progress takes a lot more kind of like research person hours than it used to, possibly because the low-hanging fruit of like insights and inventions have been plucked. And so now we're just working on much harder problems. So empirically, there's like some evidence for this. Let's see, I think there's some in agriculture where additional improvements to agricultural yields take many times more researcher years than they did several decades ago. And so that's kind of this like several decades ago, there were like really promising new technologies that a couple of people could discover. Whereas now we have teams and companies and like,
I guess it's harder to get teams to work together well.
And just like we found the like really intuitive technologies, and the next technologies that like might be out there are just
they don't jump as easily to the human mind.
Yeah, exactly. So there's one reason. It's also the case that relative to several decades ago, when a large percentage of the population was undereducated, like mostly the population is about as educated as some of the best educated. So I guess like before we could buy additional researchers by doing kind of baseline education interventions for people who didn't have or who weren't getting nearly as good educations. And then
lots of people weren't going to high school. So there was a lot of low-hanging fruit by just getting people to
just go
learn
people to
the
high
basic
school.
stuff.
And then you have like, there were so many people who weren't educated that you just like get new people with much higher ability to have insight. And that's like a pretty cheap intervention. But now additional education, first of all, probably just gets you fewer returns. So like sending people for a PhD relative to college probably buys you fewer insights per additional year of education. And then also just most people are getting about as much education as they want.
I think in the US, like average number of years of schooling, or like the average person ends their formal education around 21 or 22.
Wow.
Just like it's quite, because like substantial number are doing degrees.
Right.
Like the number of people dropping out of high school is fairly low. And a non-trivial number are doing postgraduate work.
Totally, right. So if the government were like, we want more experts, it'd be like starting from a really high point.
Yeah. How many of those people who are not doing PhDs are like interested on the margin of doing PhDs?
Yeah. Do you know of other reasons?
Those may be the main ones. I guess like one reason why it might be that it seems like technological progress has slowed down the last 40 years. It could just be this issue that it's getting harder to find useful stuff that we haven't already thought of. Some other people have suggested other reasons, like they think we're doing science grant funding much worse than we were before. We used to fund people, young people with exciting ideas. These days it's so bureaucratized that we basically only fund older, mature scientists who are maybe not as innovative as they were when they were in their 20s or 30s.
Right.
And so like theories or ways of thinking about things that are misguided take longer to be overturned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I have heard some arguments like that, like about patent structures and how disincentivizing that is.
Yeah, but whatever it is, I suppose the question is, will it change?
Yeah.
Like if the trend is towards more bureaucratized science funding, it might just be that we won't fix that and it will just get worse over time. So that could make things even more sclerotic.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and then I guess there's room for disagreement here, but I expect it will change. I expect that there are still lots of gains from technology, especially AI, that are going to make new knowledge insights much cheaper or something to buy. But I guess if you don't, then maybe you should be more worried than me.
Yeah, well, at some point we're surely going to have an episode about this stagnation and kind of progress studies, cluster of thinking. So we can deal with this properly then. I guess one thing I always want to point out to people who think that we're currently stagnant economically or technologically, to say global GDP growth has actually been fine. It's just that it's mostly happening through catch-up growth. So we're seeing like lots of growth in countries like China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so on. And the way they're achieving economic progress is by scaling up what we already knew how to do. More of that rather than inventing new stuff. And I guess that maybe means that we should be worried that we're not inventing new things. So eventually they'll hit the kind of technological frontier and then they'll get stuck as well.
Right.
But I think it's plausible that there's been basically a redirection of effort away from inventing new things towards bringing up all of these countries that were far away from the technological frontier and just needed to build up the institutional ability, build up the technological know-how in order to get, and that was all that was necessary to get much richer. And given that there was so much low-hanging fruit there in just the catch-up stuff, maybe there wasn't as much pressure to be coming up with completely new inventions. And so possibly as these countries, as more and more places get as rich as we know how for humans to be, with our current level of technology, we could see that stagnation reverse. Right.
Where the next lowest hanging fruit is back to thinking of new ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like China's getting to this point to some extent where they're now at least large parts of it are very wealthy, very technologically advanced, in many ways superior, I think, to places like the UK or US. And that means that those places are motivated. The people who are there, the best and brightest in China, are now potentially motivated to be inventing new things in order to build new companies rather than doing transfer learning.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I guess we'll have Will on to talk about this book when it comes out, so he can discuss how likely he thinks these different scenarios are. Maybe one that I'm interested to pull on and possibly do a different interview on is this question of, should we expect solar, wind, nuclear, possibly geothermal, other green technologies to be integrated into the grid rapidly? I feel like my intuition is to be very optimistic, just looking at the price curve reductions, both for those energy generation technologies and the energy storage. But there are smart people out there who are skeptical. They think there's going to be technological hurdles that will slow it down much more than people imagine. That even though solar panels themselves are quite cheap, adding everything that we need to the grid and the storage and integrating it into how we actually use energy, given the intermittency, could be quite challenging. So yeah, it'd be good to get to the bottom of that at some point. That's a question mark for me.
Right, and not my area, but I look forward to the interview.
Yeah, I guess if that's true, then we should be more worried about climate change on the margin, because we could be massively polluting for a whole bunch longer.
That sounds right.
Okay, so I guess, we're going to move on from the extinction stuff completely now. That was the boom and bust climate change scenarios, which I guess are among the more plausible ways that things could go super wrong. So anything you want to say to maybe wrap up everything that we've been talking about the last few hours?
Yeah, sure. So I guess overall, my takeaway is lots of plausible scenarios, at least on their faces, didn't seem to pan out. The climate change ones do seem more plausible to me, though, like you said, they've got lots of steps that themselves don't seem super likely. And then when you put them all together, the overall scenario still doesn't seem, or seems even less likely, but very much can't be ruled out. And I think is a great reason to worry more about, especially worst case scenario climate change outcomes.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on from all of this kind of dark, tragic stuff. On a totally different topic, you've got quite an interesting story about going out of your way to try to find and meet your biological father, which over the years I've heard fragments of, but not the whole thing. Yeah, what's the historical setup there? Why hadn't you known your father and his family earlier on?
Yeah, so my mom grew up in Latin America, and her parents were basically diplomats and did some international development work. And so she loved Latin America. She also felt strong pulls toward altruism. And so in her 20s, she lived in Latin America at various points. And then when figuring out how she wanted to do good with her career, she ended up becoming an immigration lawyer in DC. So she was working with asylum seekers from Central America to try to help them flee conflict. There was loads of terrible conflicts in Central America in the late 20th century. And so my father was actually one of those immigrants that had fled El Salvador. He was basically very much on the left in a country where the right was in power and causing a lot of, basically killing lots of people on the left, or disappearing them, as it was called. And so my father did things like read leftist newspapers over the radio from closets so that he couldn't be found. And he was a musician, or kind of a kind of an activist musician. So he'd like play concerts with songs that he'd written about basically like oppression and how messed up the current government was. So he was just generally, I don't have a sense of like, I think he thought of himself as very much an activist trying to push back against the really oppressive government. And he started getting threats. And at one point, I think was pulled into a van and had his clavicle broken and was basically being threatened. And so he fled the country. Yeah, the like canonical story in my family is that he fled the country with $100 bill, or maybe it was a $20 bill in his shoe. And basically went through Guatemala and Mexico to get to the US, where he crossed illegally and so then needed asylum help. Yeah. Which he got from my mom, who then, also they just fell in love. Yeah. When I was a toddler, I think the main thing it came down to is I had really different parenting styles, where I think he had like a very authoritarian parenting style. And that just really bothered my mom. So they separated and then soon after divorced. And so after I was about 2, I just didn't have contact with him. He, I think pretty soon after that, felt safe going back to El Salvador. He also just like didn't have many connections in the US. And so it was like very hard for him living there. So he went back and for reasons I don't totally understand, didn't keep in touch. So my understanding is that my mom really encouraged him to stay in touch. So I think my like kind of conjecture understanding of what he's like as a person is like, he's very present. He's very like, I don't know if he's impulsive, but he's like passionate and driven and cares a lot about people in his immediate proximity. And then I think not in proximity, he's less conscientious and attentive or something. Yeah. Which
good at a party, but like maybe not going to get back to you really quickly on WhatsApp.
Totally. Yes. That's my impression.
Yeah.
So my mom actually remarried when I was 5 or 6, and my stepdad was amazing and loving, and I had a really happy childhood. But I did have this kind of angsty, I think I just like, it was just kind of interesting to think that like I had this El Salvadoran parent who was like, I mean, a big part of my genetics and a big part of my mom's history.
And it'd been there the first few years as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And that I had a bunch of siblings because he'd had a bunch of kids before meeting my mom. And then I actually had more kids after meeting my mom. So there's just this world of genetic linkages that existed. And I found that really interesting. And I did have this like, well, why didn't he reach out? Feeling that really didn't cause me many issues, especially with like 2 loving parents that were very present. But like, I don't know, when like
escalated over time.
Yeah. And like, I could like, when I gave it some thought, I was like, that's kind of sad. And did kind of want an explanation.
Yeah. So I guess over time, the motivation to go and find your dad grew. What was around the age when you decided to actually take action?
Yeah, so it was really opportunistic. I'd always been drawn to Latin America, in part because my first language was Spanish because of Joaquin. And so that was just easy and convenient place to travel. And then I guess just also this mythology just made Latin America really appealing, and especially Central America. And so when I went to college, I had a vision of studying abroad in Central America. So I chose a program basically just on this basis, which ended up really kind of predicting a lot, or like leading to a lot of other things. Like it was a sociology program. Yeah. And I don't think I would have studied sociology if I hadn't gone on this program. Yeah. But anyway, so this program was in Guatemala. I knew Guatemala was a neighbor of El Salvador. And I don't know if I had a great sense of how quick it would be to get there. I think I did. I think I like noticed at some point, like, oh, a bus would be 6 hours to El Salvador, where my father lives. That's crazy to think about. Usually he's been like in another universe. So I kind of like sat on that. I also just started looking for them all on Facebook, which I'd never thought of before. Since my father and then any of my siblings, because I like knew their names and thought maybe I'd recognize them. And I even found my sister, Febe, who's like kind of close to my age. She was 4 years older. And messaged her and just never heard back. So I was like, oh no, maybe this isn't, or just like maybe this is doomed.
Yeah. At this point, are you in Guatemala?
Yeah, I'm in Guatemala.
Right.
And I'm just like, I think it's just triggered by the fact that I'm so close. I'm just like thinking a lot about this. And yeah, so I thought maybe I'd get in through my sister. She didn't respond. So then I decided maybe I'd just try to go to the place that my mom lived there with him.
Yeah, did your family back in the US suspect anything at all, or were they completely clueless about this?
So I actually did tell my mom, and then kind of soon after tell my stepdad, Jim. And I thought really hard about how I wanted to tell him and try to make it really clear that I feel loved. I feel like I have a dad.
Yeah.
There's just this other mystery thing that I'd like to learn more about.
This is before you went to...
Yeah, it's before I went. This was like, I'm considering doing this. I also kind of want my mom's help. So I guess I have to tell you.
Yeah.
But did try to be really sensitive. And yeah, they were like, I think they were like, this is both a terrible idea, but also totally get why you would want to do it. And
it's not our place to stop you.
Yeah. So kind of libertarian about it. And I think my mom especially like appreciated the like, yeah, she's got an adventurous side to her. So she, I think, was like, yeah, this will be an experience. I don't know if it'll be good or bad, but yeah, you're welcome to have it. So
yeah, tell us about the day or the week where you tried to go do it.
Yeah, well, so I really had no idea. I'd never asked much about where he lived or where he and my mom had lived together. I knew that they'd spent some time in El Salvador, and I knew that my mom was pretty connected to his family, or like had been. So I asked her if she had an address.
Yeah.
And she was like,
a phone number or something.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And her response was basically like, they don't have addresses in the town where we would have lived, and they don't. I mean, maybe they have phones, but this would have been the early 90s. And I don't think my grandmother would have had a phone.
Big phone user.
Yeah. So I was like, can you tell me where they live? And she's like, not really, but I can describe it. So she basically pulled up Google Maps, and we used the street view.
Street view, yeah.
Yeah. And she was like, oh, I recognize this church. I think it's in this neighborhood. I recognize that this looks out onto a lake. It's like kind of like a cliff onto a lake. And I think it was one of these streets, and it had a turquoise door. So I was like, okay, it's not a very big town.
Hopefully they haven't repainted.
Exactly. Yeah. I was writing a lot on them not repainting.
Yeah.
But so I took a bus, went to the town. It was actually just shockingly easy once I got there. I like immediately saw the church. I'm like the first street I went down, I saw a blue door, or the turquoise door.
Yeah.
And there was an old woman in the door, and there was someone walking down the street. And I think I asked them, do you happen to know if this is where this person lives? And they're like, that's her right there.
Yeah.
So that is how I met my grandmother.
Okay, yeah.
And as soon as I walked up, I guess she was confused for like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And then I kept saying my name and my mom's name and Joaquin's name. And then she pulled out like stacks of photo albums of me.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, as a toddler, and was just like really moved.
Yeah, how did she react? She was happy to see you.
She was really happy to see me. Yeah. She like thought she never would. And she really was close to my mom while she and my mom and my dad were together. So she wanted to hear all about her. And
so this was your grandmother's house?
It's my grandmother's house. Yeah.
Were there other people living there you also got to meet? This sounds like, I don't know, it sounds like quite an awkward situation in a way. But yeah.
Totally. Yeah. No, it was super awkward. And part of me was like, why am I doing this? This is just really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was uncomfortable. It's not like we had like loads of natural conversation flowing.
Yeah.
It was like we had a couple of people that we both knew that were, I mean, like genetically linked. She knew my mom well. There wasn't quite a language barrier. I mean, I spoke Spanish and so did she, but her native language was an indigenous one.
Ah, right. El Salvadorians have such strong accents. I find it so hard to follow El Salvadorian Spanish.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we just like kind of struggled and like had an awkward couple of meals together.
Yeah. But she was living alone.
She like remarried and lived with her partner, who was lovely, who was actually like really, really lovely and happy I was there.
But presumably you're still interested to meet your dad, right?
Yeah. So she like had his phone number on like a crummy little cell phone. And we spent the day trying to call him and like kind of on brand. He was super hard to get a hold of. So she knew the town he was living and like probably they saw each other a couple times a year. But he was like a good 4 hours away.
But what year was this, by the way? I'm trying to imagine what technology we've got here.
Yes. So this is 2014. Yeah. So I was 20. And yeah, I mean, they're also just like, they're poor. So like I had a lovely...
You weren't on iMessenger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she got in touch with him and yeah, he asked to meet. He basically agreed to meet halfway at like a little fast food restaurant. And it was also just like extremely awkward. But
What did you talk about? Well, I don't... what do you say first? It's like, hey, I'm your daughter.
Yeah. It was really, really strange. Well, first of all, he like wrote up.
Because he was a total stranger to you. I guess you weren't a total stranger to him. He had met you, but it's been a while. It's been a minute.
Yeah, exactly. Before I had conscious thoughts, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was like, what was the first thing? I think it's funny. You like don't say things like, I'm your daughter, you're my father. You say like, hey, how was your trip getting here? Like, do you want to order food? Yeah. Which is like in some ways bizarre.
Got to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, he was just like really interested in what my life was like and really interested in how my mom was. Yeah. I mean, it was a lot of like, how is everyone doing? He had remarried and had really young children. So he had an 8-year-old.
And he would have been mid-50s at this point. Or
maybe
50s.
Late 50s.
Oh, late 50s.
Because he was a decade older than my mom.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think this was his like 9th child. So yeah, what else do we talk about?
He lived a full life, I guess.
He did live a very full life. Yes. Very full and Catholic life without birth control.
Was he still political?
Yeah, he was super political.
That seems like it could have been a common interest.
Yes, yeah. So it totally was. Altruism in general was a common interest. At that time, I think I was planning to go into international development and he was clearly really proud. So that was a really good feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it both was a good feeling and then also, I like realized I cared a bit less about what he thought than I expected.
Yeah.
I was like, I definitely am more glad that my stepdad is proud of me than I am that he's proud of me.
Yeah.
But I think there was something like he and I really share altruism and trying to make the world better. And we think about it really differently. But like, I really valued knowing that like he has intense empathy. But so, he rode a motorcycle to meet up with me. And so then he invited me back to stay with him and his wife for a few days, which I did. So I rode on the back of his motorcycle and met them. And I mean, it was just a lot of small talk. It was like a bit harder to go deeper. There were a couple of things in common, like my mom and my life and his life. And I really liked meeting his wife and daughter. They were really, really sweet. So like the most serious stuff we talked about then was probably like we really cared about how our lives had gone and how everyone in them was doing. And we kind of cared to some extent, not superficially, but kind of shallowly about altruism. But a lot of it was awkward.
Yeah, I imagine.
We just were strangers.
Yeah, did you find you had to do like similarities or like similar, I don't know, what do you call mannerisms and so on?
Yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, we look identical. Okay. So the first picture we have together as adults is just like
uncanny.
Yeah, it's a bit disturbing because people have always told me I look like my mom, but we just were identical.
Yeah.
I don't know about mannerisms. He was like, he had some kind of effective altruism-ish ways of thinking. So like he like talked a lot about effective and ineffective ways of doing political advocacy and kind of about cost effectiveness. He didn't use that language, but he was basically like, this works a bit better, but per resource, basically, like it looks worse. He's pretty rational. Yeah, I guess I feel like I get something like, I do feel like I get a lot from my mom, but I kind of wondered where something like maybe curiosity and ambition came from. And he seemed like kind of romantically curious and like intrinsically driven to learn things.
Yeah.
He was only educated through primary school, but basically later on got a high school diploma and was better read than I was, including in English.
That's impressive.
Yeah, really, really impressive. So I think it was something like, it's not exactly that I was like, oh, that's where I get my curiosity from. It was more like, oh, it'd be nice. I'd love to have that trait from him.
Yeah.
There are like some things I saw that I would be like proud to share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you connect with any of your sisters in particular? I suppose so you had 8 of them.
Yeah,
sorry.
I did.
So 8 brothers and sisters. Yeah.
Yeah. So soon after that, I actually only ended up connecting with a sister and brother who I'd actually lived with for like my first year or something. My sister was living with my mom and Joaquin while they were together. So her name is Pepe. And yeah, she's
the one who didn't reply, right?
She didn't reply at first. Yeah. But through kind of everyone else that I did meet, we got her phone number and she was thrilled to hear from me, wanted to meet up. I ended up staying with her for more like a week. And she's actually like, it feels like more of like a win. So we met soon after. Just immediately, we just were very good friends. And she's got like really cool views and is like an advocate for she's like very feminist and she's like an advocate for women being allowed to have abortions, which is like extremely politically charged in El Salvador. And yeah, I was just like, you're so cool. And is also very well read in like feminist literature and she speaks English and Spanish, so we had even more fluent conversations. Yeah. So
why
she was
hadn't she replied? Because she hadn't seen the message.
So I asked her.
Had it gone to like the Facebook Messenger like a spam filter thing because you guys weren't friends already?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Right, yeah. Classic.
So as soon as we were friends, she was like, "Oh my god, I see your message now." Yeah. She actually was really emotional that she hadn't seen it earlier because I think there's like a 4-month gap or something. Which I guess isn't that long in the scheme of things. But
yeah, listeners, go out and check the... you can find instructions on Google for how to find this special inbox that Facebook hides from you because it thinks that it's like spammy messages because there's people you're not already connected with. But I think it produces this pretty often where it's like someone's trying to reconnect with someone who they don't have other social connections with and Facebook is like, nope.
Nope, sorry. You're a bot.
Yeah.
So she and I just really get on and we still do. And we're in regular touch. And I haven't visited her, obviously, in the past few years because of the pandemic. But before that, we visited each other every few years. She came to my college graduation and yeah, I feel very close to her. So that was a huge win. My father, basically as soon as I left, it kind of fell back into like, if you're not there, he's not a very good communicator.
Not a huge correspondent,
Yeah, so we weren't in touch again, but I did feel like I had this like, cool, I know what he's like. I know where he is. If I really needed to, I could probably get in touch now. I do have his phone number and email. It might be kind of hard, but I didn't really try, which felt fine. And he didn't really either, which also felt fine. Yeah. And then he ended up again being kind of threatened by, I think this time it was not the government, but it was more gangs in his city.
So this is less political or
I mean, it's probably kind of all interconnected, but yeah, it was more like gang violence in El Salvador has been getting really bad.
Yeah.
And so he again tried to seek asylum in the US, reached out to me to see if I could help. And so we were kind of reconnected that way. And he did end up moving to California a few years ago. And I saw them once. And actually this is when I think I did feel closer to him. So
he brought his family as well?
Yeah. He did. He brought his wife, his daughter, and his new baby. But so I did see them. We went and took a hike in a redwood park. I forget which one. And yeah, this time I think, I don't know what was different, but we did talk about some more deep things. It's kind of interesting because his wife is super religious. And I don't know to what extent they've discussed this, but he asked me in English, he was like, do you believe in God? And I was like, not really, but I believe in doing good. And like, that motivates me a lot. And he was like, yeah, I once read that God is the opiate of the masses. And I just feel like I just learned a lot about how, I mean, really well read he was, how non-traditional some of his views were relative to the like social environment he was in. Like, I think he wouldn't have said that to his wife.
Sounds like that might not be prudent.
Exactly. So I think he's actually just kind of rogue and like for himself or something. Yeah, nonconformist, like you said. And yeah, we did talk more just about philosophies. We talked about effective altruism. He thought it sounded great.
Cool.
Yeah.
Got to get him to listen to the show.
Yeah.
His English must be pretty good, I guess.
It is pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it got a bit worse, but it's still pretty good. And he still like reads, and yeah, so it's like good enough to read complicated books in English.
Yeah. Pues hola, Joaquín. Espero que llegues a este punto del programa.
Yeah, hola.
Yeah, that's it's an amazing story. Thanks so much for sharing it. I'm glad to hear it all laid out at once.
Pretty good outcome.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground, and it's time to come to the end. But yeah, I suppose one final personal question Kieran and I had for you is, I guess you're working at 80,000 hours now, but if you had to completely change careers and you gave up all of this altruism, that business that you've been interested in for so long, became indifferent to making the world a better place, what would be the most self-indulgent or most personally enjoyable career for you to pursue in place of all of that?
Yeah, I actually totally have an answer for this. Yeah, and I kind of fantasize about doing as much good as I can, and then like in my retirement or something, retraining as a therapist. I find my own therapy with my two therapists really fascinating. Like, just look forward to it, get tons out of it, and have read just loads of books on mostly like cognitive behavioral therapy, but also some like more like psychotherapy stuff. And I basically just find it really basically fun to talk to people about, I guess it's often like things that are going wrong and could be going better. But also just about like how they work, what their like thought patterns are like, what parts of their personality are driving tiny behaviors. Just find it really, really interesting. And then, find it very kind of emotionally satisfying to sometimes help people challenge negative thought patterns or reframe negative parts of their lives or something.
I guess that makes sense. You're building a very deep connection with a stranger quite suddenly, and I guess it's also very curiosity arousing, and you get to kind of solve the puzzle of the things that are going right and wrong in their life. And
it's super puzzly. I find that bit really satisfying when someone feels like understood about something that varies a lot between people. You kind of feel like, I don't know, a magician. They seem to really get a lot out of that.
Do you think most therapists enjoy their work? I feel like, I guess my intuition had been that therapists are dealing with heavy stuff a lot of the time. And like, if I was a therapist, I'd probably need a bunch of therapists to help me deal with the heavy nature of the subject matter. Yeah.
I can imagine that it would be really hard. I think I like, more than lots of people, help my friends process things that are hard about their lives and do sometimes find that really tiring. I think I probably would work really well with some types of clients. Like, I don't know if it's weird to say, but like, I think working with someone like me who's motivated and introspective would probably just, well, who knows? I could be saying this and then be really disappointed. But I would expect that would just feel more motivating if someone is like motivated to make progress. I imagine I'd have a really hard time working with clients who weren't sure that things in their life could be improved. Yeah, I guess I'm probably also underestimating how hard it is to talk about the most traumatic of things. Maybe that would be much harder to do on the day-to-day. I know that the therapists I work with cap the number of sessions they have per day at like 2 or 3.
It's quite draining, I imagine.
Really emotionally intense.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you make a great therapist. And I suppose if you ever take it on more seriously, I imagine you'll become even better.
Oh, that's really, really kind. Yeah. Maybe in 40 years.
Yeah. I guess it doesn't feel like much of a retirement plan, but I suppose it could be a great thing to dedicate your time to once you've feel like you've done the most good in the core part of your career.
Yeah.
My guest today has been Luisa Rodriguez. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Luisa.
Thanks for having me. It's really fun.
Okay, you're already 3.5 hours into this one, so why not stick around a minute more for me to mention some other 80,000 Hour services you might well find useful. First off, the 80,000 Hours team has been releasing a lot of new and updated pages on the website lately, including a report on China-related AI safety and governance paths, as well as the post Be More Ambitious, a rational case for dreaming big if you want to do good. You can find our new written work at 80,000hours.org/latest, or sign up to get email updates about our latest research every few weeks at 80,000hours.org/newsletter. Second, our job board currently has 676 available vacancies and study opportunities across all the various problem areas that we discuss on this show, and including some for undergraduates, as well as some for people who are already well into their careers. There's more remote roles than in the past, I think 147 as I'm recording this, which might make it easier to find relevant options if you're not living in a major US or UK city already. You can check out those roles and filter them down to options that might be right for you at 80,000hours.org/jobs. Finally, there's our advising team, who are speaking with more people than ever about how they can have more impact with their work. The service is free, of course, and you can find out what our advisors can and can't do for you and apply to speak with us at 80,000hours.org/speak. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris. Audio mastering is by Ben Cordell. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.